Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me here to talk about this really important topic. So this presentation is going to be personal in the sense that I'm going to present here my craft of writing qualitative papers. And of course, that is not the only way to do it, but it will be a very practical, hands-on advice about what I do when I go about writing a qualitative paper, from the beginning of the design process to considerations about the process, to theoretical models, to how we're actually going to frame a qualitative paper, and how are we going to then write it up. And so I've titled this 5 times 5 simple rules, because I'm going to go through these 5 domains, and for each of the 5 domains, I'm going to present 5 simple rules, because I thought this was a great way in which you guys can remember specific advice or heuristics about how might we go about trying to write up our qualitative papers. So I want to start out by saying, why do we actually do qualitative research? Well, oftentimes we do this in order to develop new theories. Qualitative research often shines light, deep light, into a few individual cases to try to generate new important insights about theory that we otherwise are not able to have. And this is actually not unique to just management science. If we look across the sciences, we actually see that deep diving into individual cases have been a cornerstone in the way that scientific research has actually evolved. If we think about something like neuroscience, then a lot of neuroscience has actually developed and evolved by shining light on individual cases and case studies that have told us a lot about the brain. The same goes with engineering, where shining light on individual, for example, failures, building collapses, bridge failures. These deep dives into individual cases have actually been very important for developing new theory, not just in management, but across the sciences. And so, however, when we want to do these deep dives into our qualitative research, it can be very hard to do. In particularly, we can be confronted with what I call the data theory death trap. This happens because when we, for example, have some data and we have some concepts, we might start with a few concepts, but when we look at our data, we see more concepts and categories that evolve from our data. Each of these then multiply into new and more categories that we see as we go through our data, and we begin to see the nuances of the data. And so as we begin to understand the richness of our data, the data and our categories that we have around these concepts also tends to multiply, and we can end up more confused than we were in the beginning. We feel overwhelmed by the amount of data that we have and the amount of concepts that are swimming around in our coding efforts. The same thing can happen on the theory side. We start out maybe with a single theory, a single paper we find interesting, and that we think might be relevant to our paper project. However, from that paper, we learn about other papers that might be interesting. We go to these papers, we read them, we find out that, wow, these papers cite a lot of other papers that are relevant for our concept. And so we go to those papers, and turns out those papers also cite a lot of other papers. And so the amount of theory that there is about the topic that we're trying to write about multiplies. And so it's easy to find yourself in the middle of these two overwhelming amounts of information. On the one hand, the overwhelming amount of data and understandings of our data that we have, and on the other hand, an overwhelming amount of theory that already exists out there. And what I'm going to try to do today is say, I'm going to try to provide some tips for how we can actually manage this data theory death trap and not feel overwhelmed and frustrated, and thus not make any progress on our qualitative paper. I find that there are some basic struggles that we have when we write qualitative papers. One is between writing a paper that is very descriptive. and extremely close to our data. This is a paper that goes through all the nuances of the individual paper, of our context, everything that we've learned, detailing everything that is going on in our data. And on the other hand, writing papers that are too abstract, that deals with a very big macro theory. For example, it could be new institutionalism or actor network theory. And so we have this very abstract big theory that we are working with, and the paper gets written at this very abstract level. The problem with the descriptive paper is that it's too close to the data and it ends up being atheoretical. The problem with the very abstract paper is that you end up with a data theory gap. That is that you have in a sense a grand theory that you're trying to develop, but your data is much more descriptive, and thus the data doesn't support the theory that you're trying to develop in a very in a very solid way. And so it's important that we find that place in the middle that's just right, in between a too descriptive paper and a too abstract paper. Another struggle is between a paper that's very simple versus one that's very complicated. In general, as I've been a reviewer and an editor on qualitative papers, my experience is that the struggle that most authors have when writing a qualitative paper is that their paper becomes too complicated. We want to describe everything that is going on in our context, in our data. So we end up with a lot of variables, with a lot of details, and a story that is very difficult to follow, because we want to give the reader a sense of the complexity of our data. And we also feel that telling a story that's simpler is somehow not being truthful to our data, because we know that whenever we tell a simpler story, there are a lot of details that we are omitting and not disclosing to the reader. And so oftentimes, when I read qualitative papers, they tend to become too complicated. But the problem is that when a qualitative paper is very complicated, it's very difficult to follow, and it also becomes very difficult to make a theoretical contribution. So in order to try to help you guys make progress on your qualitative papers, as I mentioned, I'm going to go through what I call 5 times 5 simple rules. These simple rules are really not rules, they're heuristics. And they don't represent a universal truth about how to write a qualitative paper. They really reflect my personal process. They reflect what I do, what I try to tell my PhD students and my junior co-authors about how to write a qualitative paper. It reflects the process that works for me. And has worked for me in the past, but that's not to say that this is what will work for everyone. I'll go through 5 simple rules about designing qualitative studies, the process of doing qualitative analysis, making theoretical models, framing a qualitative paper, and writing up a qualitative paper. So first, 5 simple rules about research design. So research design is very important because it is really the foundation of our study. If we don't have a good research design, we cannot write a good paper, because we can only write a good paper if we have the adequate data to actually write that paper. And the first question that confronts us when we try to design a qualitative study is to actually choose the right method. And so here it's important that if your question is focused on theory building, it is the right thing to choose qualitative research. Qualitative research is used for theory building. In contrast, if your question is deductive, you would be better off designing a survey, an experiment, or doing quantitative archival analysis. Because if you already know a lot of things about your question, you should be able to use some of these methods that will be much better at causal identification than qualitative research is. Qualitative research cannot do causal identification. Qualitative research can say something about what might be. We can suggest something that might happen in the world and thus propose a new theory that we can then subsequently go out and test quantitatively. But qualitative research cannot prove causality. So this is the first thing that you need to do. You will have to be thinking about what are you actually trying to do. And if you're trying to do theory building, then qualitative research will be the right method for you. Then the second thing is to try to identify the type of paper that you're writing. So it's important for us to think about the fact that there are actually different kinds of qualitative paper, and that will matter for the kind of data that you'd want to collect. And of course, you might not know upfront what type of paper that you're writing, but the more that you know about it, the better you'll be able to generate and collect the kind of data that will be helpful for you in trying to develop theory. So I have categorized papers into three different kinds of big categories of papers. There are process papers, variance papers, and what I call single concept papers. So in process papers tend to be an in-depth case study, a deep dive into a case or a lot of interviews with different participants. And the contributions of these process papers is to identify mechanisms which generate a particular outcome, right? So we have identified an outcome that we want to study. That could, for example, be the choice of working from home versus going to the office. So what are some of the mechanisms that shape people's decisions about whether to work from home or whether to commute into the office? And we can then do a lot of interviews, for example, with people to try to identify what are the mechanisms that shapes this decision about going to the office versus working from home. And then an example of that is, for example, my own ASQ paper, where I detail the processes that shape the symbolic and the social boundary in the nanotechnology field. So these kind of papers, we are focused on trying to identify mechanisms. Then there are studies which is a comparative case study. So you have, for example, two cases, and you're using these two cases to try to develop theory. One advice I have here, because I've seen a lot of people have difficulties and struggle with this, is that if you have a comparative case study, it is important that what you're trying to do is actually to show how the process is the same across the settings, not how they're different. That's because if you have two cases, it's actually not surprising that the process was different in different settings. What is surprising is that the process is the same in different settings. So if I'm, for example, studying the careers of jazz players and the careers of management professionals, and I'm comparing these two, it's not surprising that the careers of jazz musicians is different from management professionals. But what is surprising is that they might be the same, that there might be processes that we see in both kinds of career paths that are the same across these two contexts. So we want to at least focus the majority of our paper on looking at how they are the same. Maybe at the end of the paper, we can then discuss what are the boundary conditions that actually means that they might be that these mechanisms that we have identified play out slightly differently in different contexts. An example of this is O'Mahony and Becky's 2006 work on stretch work, where they look at two different occupations and first show actually how they were surprisingly similar, but then also how they were different in certain regards. Another overarching class of papers is variance papers. Many of these are, for example, multiple case studies. So you have multiple cases, you select these on the dependent variable, on the outcome. You try to select your cases so that you will have variance on the outcome. There will be some successful cases and there'll be some unsuccessful cases. And then you try to explain what made some of the cases successful and some of them unsuccessful. And so Kathy Eisenhardt and her students have done a lot of these kind of papers where they, for example, look at certain firms that were successful, for example, entering a market, and some that were unsuccessful at entering a market, and try to identify the strategies of the successful firms versus the unsuccessful firms, right? And the important thing here is that you need to select your cases based on the outcome you're interested in. So you're sure you get variance, get some that are successful and some that are not successful. A more difficult, I think, kind of a variance study, and that is not as prevalent in our field, is also to upfront design your variance so that you have two cases that are exactly the same on all dimensions except for one. And that one dimension is the one you're trying to use to explain an outcome. So you see how this comparative case study differs from the one above, because this is actually trying to explain variance. However, in order to write this kind of paper, your research design up front needs to be extremely sharp, because you need to have chosen your two cases such that they are completely comparable on all dimensions that the reviewers might think matter. I think a person who's been able to write these kind of papers, and one of the only people in our field who has done this very successfully, I think, is Kate Keller's work, where she, for example, sets up two hospitals, looks at two hospitals that were exactly the same on all dimensions that you might think would matter, but they varied in terms of an outcome. And so she's able to look at then what is the mechanism that then drove that outcome. But I have to, you have to be extremely careful with your design and your choice of these cases up front in order to tell such a variant story. The third category is what I call single concept papers. And this is a paper where the whole paper is focused on providing insight really in one big concept only. And so here there's no, the paper is not structured around mechanisms, identifying mechanisms, but you have one big kind of theory concept, and everything you do in the paper tries to prove that one thing. For examples, Beth Betzky's paper on where the whole paper is focused really on showing that the transformation of local understandings is vital to effective knowledge sharing in organizations. And so, but this really necessitates that there's enormous kind of big gap in the literature that you're able to fill in order to write such a big concept paper. Right, but you can see how when designing your study, it's important to have an idea about what's the kind of paper that I'm trying to write. And then the third rule within this is, then you have to collect data with variance. Particularly if you're writing a variance paper, it is of course very important that you construct your sample so there's variance across your main outcome. So if you want to write a variance paper, you have to make sure that that is the way you select your data. The data has to go in and make sure that, okay, we find firms, for example, that are successful, some that are unsuccessful. Or it could be on the individual level. You can select individuals that had successful careers versus ones that had non-successful careers and try to compare them. But it's important that you have variance on that outcome. If you're writing a process paper, I also think it's much easier to write a process paper if you have variance in your main outcome over time, because it becomes much more easy to show how the mechanisms work if your main variable actually changes over time. So for example, in my paper on the symbolic and the social boundaries of the nanotechnology field, those boundaries varied over time. The symbolic boundary varied over time and the social boundary varied over time. And that meant I could look at the mechanisms that affected the contraction or the expansion of these boundaries over time. It's not to say that you cannot write a process paper if you don't have longitudinal data or if you don't have this variation. It's just a good tip to saying it's easier to do it if you have that. And so you can think about that when you're designing you're designing your study. How can I get this kind of variance over time? It's also important that we collect data that allows for triangulation. The more robust you can actually make your data over time by allowing the triangulation between different data sources, the stronger your claims are able to be. So you can, for example, think about, am I able to triangulate across interviews, ethnographic observations, and archival data? Am I able to see the concept that I'm trying to study from these multiple different lenses? Because if I am, I'll have more robustness in my data and I'll have more conviction in the conclusions that I make based on my data, that they're actually correct. And the last simple rule that I have about research design is the most important one, and that is collect a lot of data. When in the beginning of your study, it might seem like a lot of work to collect data. However, I'm telling you that data collection is the least time-consuming part of writing a paper, at least a paper. And here I have to say that when I'm talking, and all of the advice that I'm giving is about writing papers for the top management journals in North America, because that's just the experience that I have, and that's where I'm coming from, right? And so while it seems as though data collection is time consuming, I would encourage you to spend time here, because you have to remember that the data is the foundation of your research. And it's like building a house. When you're building a house, if you don't have a good foundation to build your house on, your house is going to collapse. If you don't have good data, you can just never write a really good paper. If you're trying to submit a paper to a top journal, if you don't have a big data set, you might just get desk rejected. You might not even get to play, your theory might not even get to be considered, because people will feel that your data is not strong enough. It's the all important thing about collecting a lot of data is that your research question is bound to change over time. That's what we need to do when we do qualitative research. We need to be flexible. We need to be able to change our perspective to go and examine the thing that might be really important and interesting in our data. However, if your data set is very small, it doesn't allow for that flexibility. You won't have as much opportunity to actually change your research question and focus on the thing inside your data that is truly interesting. So having enough data to actually have that flexibility and to build a strong foundation is really important. And here I also want to say that data collection is not just something that happens in the beginning. In particular, if you're doing archival analysis, it should be an ongoing process. We can always go back and collect more data. Data is the foundation of everything you do. All your theories should come from your data. And so I would encourage you to never shy away from saying, okay, I really need this new piece of data. That is it. That go ahead and collect that. Make sure that your data set is really strong. So the 5 simple rules about research design is: first, choose the right method for your question, identify the type of paper that you're writing, collect data with variance, collect data which allows for triangulation, but most importantly, collect a lot of data. And now that we're here, I would like to just stop for a brief moment and take a few questions if there are any.
Stine, I don't think that we have questions in the chat. Right,
oh, so, Manesh, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you for this beautiful presentation. I wanted to ask, when do we decide that we have collected a lot of data? Like, when is that time that we know, yeah, it's enough? What makes us go? Is it just theoretical saturation, or we should keep going beyond that to see if there are other elements that can be discovered?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And because of course we can go on infinitely collecting data, and there's also definitely an upper limit to our data collection efforts. And so yes, at first it's about theoretical saturation, that we feel that we are not really learning anything new based on the data that we are actually collecting. If we're doing interviews, we feel that we're asking the same questions, we're getting the same answers. I can predict when I go into an interview more or less what people are going to say. And when I have that feeling, I'll stop interviewing, at least for now, until I have new questions to ask. Because when the more insight I get into my paper, I might want to go out and collect more data. If you're collecting archival data, I think it's more challenging because you don't have that insight into the data as you're collecting it. The data tends to be more heterogeneous. So you don't have as much insight. There, I actually think it's good to create at first a very small sample, begin to analyze it. And as you're analyzing, you collect more data again. So it's a very iterative process where you begin to collect data around the different theoretical constructs that you are interested in. So that when you have archival data, it tends the relationship between data analysis and data collection is much more ongoing and iterative than when you do interviews. I mean, that's also just for practical reasons. It can be difficult for us to go back into the field to do interviews, but with archival data, most of it will be at our fingertips, right? If we are using archives, digital archives that are on the internet, whether things that have historical records that have been digitized, or different kind of online chat rooms, or what we are doing there, we can constantly be circling between develop our constructs and going into the field to actually sample on the constructs that we are interested in. I'll take another question.
Thank you very much. There are some questions in the chat asked and answered. So if you want to ask your question on the call, please raise your hand in the reactions instead of the chat.
Yes.
I think the next is Noor.
Yes, thank you so much, Sergi. Well, talking about collecting too much data, in fact, in my case, what really happened was that I collected a lot of data, and now I'm in the process of putting it in the data analysis. And now I see that it's so complex that I really cannot, I've done it through coding, but it's very difficult for me to choose what to quote, what not to quote. So it's like over coding, and I'm unable to, contain it, and I'm unable to select because there's too much of data. So kindly help me in that. Thank you.
Yes. I mean, so then you are in that kind of data theory trap, that I talked about in the beginning, right? You're there in the middle between all of this data, and it's overwhelming. And there, I think it's important for you to think about, I don't have to write something about everything that's in my data. I have to choose, first of all, and I'll get to that later, we need to first just think about not code, not do open coding, read through your data and try to think about what's puzzling here. What is one puzzle? Doesn't have to pertain to all of my data, but what is one interesting puzzle that I see in my data? And then once I have that puzzle, I will try to code for things that explains my puzzle. I won't code for everything that's in my data. I will just try to focus on things that actually is related to the one puzzle that there's there. And this means not coding a lot of the things that's in your data, because I'm sure that you could write maybe 100 papers out of your data, right? There's so many interesting and fun and fascinating things going on in the data, but you have to write one paper at a time and focus on one idea, one question, one puzzle at a time, and only code the things that are related to that. And I don't see that as a problem with the data being too big or you collecting more data. It's more a problem of the method through which we code, and we begin to narrow in on the things that are actually interesting inside of our data.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'll take one last question before I move on.
Stine, there was a question on the YouTube, and it is, I mean, it's pretty much similar. So what do you call a lot of data? Is it 60 interviews, 100 interviews? So essentially, we need to explain when is the saturation point.
Mm-hmm. That will of course differ with regards to your research design. For example, how much heterogeneity do you have in terms of different, let's say, actors you're studying, right? Or different contexts you're studying. So let's say you're only studying one kind of actor. Let's say you're interested in Uber drivers, right? And their experience of working as an Uber driver. Then you only have one type of person, right, in one setting. And so then you might reach saturation quicker, right? I would say that in a top American, North American journal, you would probably at least need to have, let's say, 40 interviews. However, I think that if the complexity of your research design expands, let's say you're not just interested in Uber drivers, but you're also interested in the customers, right? So you're also doing interviews with customers and what are their experience of actually using Uber and what are their interactions with the driver. Now you have two different kinds of actors in your research design. You have Uber drivers and you have their customers. And thus you will need more interviews because it'll take you longer to reach saturation on each of these different segments of your data. Or you might be collecting data on Uber drivers, not just, let's say, in the United States, but you're also doing it in Tanzania, right? And so you have these two settings, the United States and Tanzania, and the differences about being an Uber, like looking at both the similarities. As I said, if we have a comparative case study like that, the first elements need to be focused on what are the similarities between the experience of being an Uber driver in North America and then in Tanzania, but then also maybe how they're different. But if we have more actors, more settings, more in a sense cells that we are interested in our research design, we will of course need to have more interviews. Okay, I'll move on, and after the talk, I can take more questions. But I'll stop after each of these each of the 5 sections in my talk and take some more questions. So the second topic that I want to talk about is 5 simple rules about the research process. So how do we actually go about the process of doing our research? So my first rule about the research process is what I just the advice that I just gave is that we should start by reading through our data to identify what is actually puzzling in this context. What is it actually that we think somehow empirically just seems odd? Is there something that seems really interesting to us here? Is there something that grabs our imagination? And sometimes, of course, that's difficult to put your finger on, like, why is this thing puzzling? But you need to activate that kind of curiosity. Qualitative research is about using yourself as a person, about actively thinking about the problem and being, in that sense, creative about what is it, why does this thing actually seem to contradict things that I would have expected, right? We want to focus in on those elements of our data that seems to be surprising and interesting and different from what I would have thought, right? Is there something, for example, about being an Uber driver that I wasn't expecting when I was doing this? Might it be that I always thought that people were just driving Uber for money, but some people say that, they actually feel lonely and they drive Uber sometimes just kind of to pass time and to actually be with other people or something like that, right? I don't know what, in your data, it'll be unique. So I can't tell you what it is in your data that's puzzling. I can only encourage you to just go ahead and really try to find that thing, because finding some kind of empirical puzzle, something that you think is interesting, something that fascinates you in your data, is going to be the beginning, because that is how you can begin to get a better handle on this complexity and not be inside, the data theory trap, and not just be overwhelmed by your data. When you begin to find that kind of golden nugget, something that is interesting, I really discourage people from start by just doing open coding. I know that is the way that our qualitative research is taught in certain places, but I have just experience with both my own experience with my students and with my junior colleagues, and when I've traveled around the world to give talks about qualitative data analysis, that you can get really lost doing open coding if you don't have a guiding question, something that is puzzling to you, something that you're interested in knowing about, that you are coding to try to learn about a specific thing. When I started working on my nanotechnology project for my dissertation, I was just open coding. And my Atlas file was out of this world. I had thousands of codes of all sorts of things. And the more I coded, the more confused I was, because I didn't have a guiding question. That really was this thing that could guide what things in my interviews and in my ethnographic observations and in my archival data to focus on. And so over time, my guiding question became this question about labeling. Why do people sometimes use the nanotechnology label or not? Why do people who do nanotechnology sometimes say they don't do it? And how did the meaning of nanotechnology change over time? And so when I began to have that guiding question, something I was puzzled about the fact that certain firms that were actually doing nanotechnology claimed that they were not nanotechnology firms. And then some firms that were not doing nanotechnology seems to be claiming they were nanotechnology firms. I didn't have a theory about it, but the empirical phenomenon was interesting to me. It was something I felt that's counterintuitive. It's not something I was expecting. And thus I began to hone in on that and say, what is it in my data that can help me explain this empirical phenomenon that nanotechnology firms sometimes don't want to be associated with nanotechnology, and that some firms that are not nanotechnology do want to be associated with it. And then, because once I had that question, I could better begin to actually code for the things that were important and actually to develop my theory. And here I also think it's important that this is specifically important if you are dealing with ethnographic data and archival data, because this data tend to be much more heterogeneous. When you're collecting this data, you are not asking questions. If you're doing ethnography, you're just taking notes on everything that is going on in the firm or the people who are working. And some of these activities are related to your research questions and some are not. In archival data, most of the things you collect will not be related to your research question. It will just be things that are going on inside the firm or inside the market. For interviews, I think you have the opportunity, at least if you know what your question is, to be much more focused. So some interview data is more focused, because if you already know what your puzzle is, a question is, you can ask, you're asking questions about that. So your data becomes structured around your puzzle, right? You're collecting data around the puzzle, but that is not true for ethnographic data and archival data. And so it's very important for us to constantly keep in mind, what is the puzzle here we're trying to solve? Another simple rule I have is to work on the theoretical model throughout the research process. This is a golden rule that I have, and the way that I work with my students. My students and I, the first thing we do after we have collected some data is to say, what could be the model? The reason for that is that it keeps you grounded on the theory, on concepts that are at an abstract level. Otherwise, it's easy to go native and become descriptive, so that you, instead of just describing everything that's going on in your data with regards to what are people actually doing, it forces you to think about, okay, I hear that an Uber driver talks about feeling lonely, right? I mean, what is that? You know, if he says, you know, I sometimes feel lonely at home or something. What is that? What is that at a theoretical level? What is that a sign of, right? And so when we are talking through the data and we'll walk through interviews, we'll walk through ethnographic observation, but at the same time, we'll say, how does that inform our model? How does that inform our theoretical idea about what is going on, right? So we're constantly moving between the data, reading and thinking about what did this person say, or what did this person do at work, or what is the statement inside the archival data. And on the other hand, how does that inform our model? How does it inform our theoretical thinking? It keeps us grounded on the level of analysis we need to be at to write our paper. And so while we're doing this, working on the model, once we have more of about an idea about what is actually our puzzle, what is the question that we are interested in, then we use what I call directed coding, which is different than open coding. Open coding, I see, is just coding everything that's in your data. Directed coding is that you are trying to constantly code for things that will elaborate, question, or update your theoretical model, right? So here it's important that you don't just have this kind of confirmatory attitude. You're not just trying to confirm the ideas you have. You are actually trying to be challenged. You're trying to make the data speak to you and push you. I think really good ideas, only good ideas, come from data. It's the data that pushes back on us. It is the statements that our informants make that challenges our ways of thinking. It is that those observations about what do people actually do in markets that will inform us that our existing theory is wrong, that there's something that's going on in the data that we can't explain, right? So this directed coding is not meant as just a confirmatory analysis. No, not at all. It is meant as a way that you're constantly testing. You're going back and you're thinking, is it true? Is it true that people drive Uber because they're lonely? Right? Is it true? And then this person says, no, you know, I'm just doing it for the money. I just need to make money. Then you're just like, oh then my hypothesis is not true. People are actually not just doing it because they're lonely. They're actually also interested in money. But what does it mean? Is it because some people do it for money and other people do it because they're lonely? Like, what's going on in our data, right? We are beginning to tease apart and think about what is actually interesting there, right? And constantly coming up with new puzzles. So I think that is like really that's just really important, right? That you're willing to constantly also update your beliefs. So I also think that my fourth simple rule is to stay blissfully ignorant of the existing literature. So this might seem counterintuitive, but I actually think that you can know too much about the literature when you start a qualitative study, because it can bias you into this kind of set of just confirmatory beliefs. Then I begin to think exactly the way that everybody who are already inside the literature thinks. And once you begin to think that way, it's difficult to get kind of pulled out of it, right? In contrast, if you are slightly blissfully ignorant about the actual theory, you will construct your model based on your data. You're trying to create a model that represents your data. And once you have that model, you can then go back to the theory and say, this is my model about how this phenomenon, what this phenomenon looks like. And now I'm going to compare it to what the literature said about this, how we should think about this phenomenon. And once I compare those two, I might realize that there's something in my model that was not in the existing literature, right? So it could be my model is completely exactly like the existing literature, and then tough luck, we'll have to go back into our data again and figure out and construct a new model or ask new questions. But I actually find that many times when you do it this way, it's a way where you become less biased towards the existing literature. You are not already embedded in all of their thoughts about the world, and you begin to be able to just construct a theory of your data. Like, this is a theory about my data, and oftentimes there'll be something in that that's different, right? So then when you go back to the literature, you'll be able to see that what is your contribution, what is it that's unique here. But when you do that, it is also very important that you're willing to forego your initial beliefs. I think this is really important. I think this is where a lot of people go wrong. They go into the field and they have an idea, and that's just this is the thing they want to study, and then they're trying to force their data to be about that. Let's say I go into the field because I'm interested in corporate social responsibility. And so I interview people about corporate social responsibility, and I really want to write a paper about corporate social responsibility. But actually the data, and the most interesting thing in the data, is not about corporate social responsibility, right? It might be about how do people perceive the future? What is it about how we're actually planning for the future and the uncertainty of our world? That is the thing that is interesting, and that corporate social responsibility might actually not play a big role in this market. That, yes, there's something about corporate social responsibility, but most of this interesting dynamics that is ongoing, the data actually has to do with kind of uncertainty management. Then I have to let go of corporate social responsibility and say, yes, I went into the field, was interested in corporate social responsibility, but my data is about uncertainty management. And that's the thing that's going on in my data. My paper has to be about that. I have to be informed by whatever's going on in the data. The data is the thing that creates my theory. I cannot force my theory onto the data. You have to be open-minded. And that can be difficult, because you might know a lot about corporate social responsibility and you might know nothing about uncertainty management. But hey, honestly, that's the joy of doing qualitative research as well. We get to learn about new domains. We get to read new literatures. We get to understand new processes. Because we're doing theory development, we cannot go into the field and have a really good understanding about what is it exactly that is going to happen in our data. It's going to be things in our data that we cannot know about, and thus you have to be willing to update your initial beliefs about your data and about what your study is actually going to be about. And I find that people have difficulties doing that and just letting go of that and just writing the paper that's in the data. Okay, I'll take a few questions if people have questions.
There are many questions in the chat. Guys, please raise your hands and we will see the line and the order. So I think we have the first in the line, Pauline. Pauline, can you please unmute yourself and put your question forward?
Yes, thank you very much. So what I was asking can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, perfect. So what I was asking myself when you started talking about the open coding and that we should not start to do that, but get a question or a guiding question about a specific thing that we want to learn about. I was asking myself, how does that guiding question differentiate from our research question or our overall research question that we're following? Is it that we're trying to split up our research question into like different smaller guiding questions that will help us to code our data, or is it completely different?
No, I think they're the same, but I just think that the thing is that you might go into the field with an overarching research question, right? Mm-hmm. But then it's important that you allow yourself to be puzzled by the data and find the things inside the data that you think is interesting, because you might have gone into the field having a grand tour question. But this grand tour question might not be the thing that's actually important or interesting inside your data, right? So let's say nanotechnology, I actually started out doing interviews about the commercialization of science. So this was my grand tour question. I went in asking about this, how was science commercialized? But the thing that was puzzling in the data was how people actually use labels. And so this was very different, right? So the thing is that you need to allow yourself to switch your research questions, to be puzzled about something else, or maybe even after you have collected your data, to realize that, there's something else that's puzzling in the data that was not my original research question. Because it is that process of updating and switching and attuning to the thing that is actually most important in the data that I think is where we can create really good contributions. And so this also differs a little bit between different kinds of data, right? As I said, if you do interview data, you might, as you're doing interviews, focus in more and more and more about the things that's puzzling because you are actually doing the interviews and you're guiding the kind of data that you're getting. If you are collecting ethnographic data, this is more difficult because you observe the things you observe and you don't know if the things you're interested in will actually happen while you are at your field site. You can, of course, become more in tuned and try to seek out the things you find interesting. Let's say over time you realize the most interesting thing is the things that happens inside meetings. And so you begin to attend more and more meetings, right? Or you find the things that is important is helping behavior. And so you begin to try to find these, but you're not always in control with an ethnographic study about the thing you're interested in will happen while you're observing. And with archival data, this is really true. The data is not created by us. It was created by somebody else for another purpose. And so these can be press releases, it can be newspaper articles, many other kinds of data that are created. And there, right, we might have a guiding question that allows us to create a sample of things we're interested in. But as we read through the data, we will then need to switch our interest and focus in on the thing that is puzzling.
Okay, thank you
I'll
very
take
much.
one more question.
Hannah, you are the next in the line. Please unmute yourself. Hannah, you need to unmute yourself first. Yeah, it seems like he's trying to put his question, but he doesn't hear that we cannot hear him. Hannah, can you please unmute yourself and put your question forward?
Is that okay?
Yeah, now it's much better. We can hear you now.
What happened is, I use the questions to do which I'm using to do coding. And I've also looked through the documents and the interviews and all the data that are collected. But I realized that at first, I realized that it was confirming the framework that I'm using, the theory that I'm using. But upon this, as I begin to think about the data, I realized that it is bringing out certain new facts. But comparing, you say that you should be ignorant of the existing literature. Does it mean that if, like, I use the literature and I also think about it again, I ask myself certain questions, what is new or what is different from the existing literature, what the data is telling me is wrong?
I would not say that it's wrong at all. I just think that we can know, I mean, my point is just that we can know too much about the literature, right? And I think, of course, and throughout the process, once we have developed our first model, we should go back to the literature, right? And really look at what is the relationship between what we've developed and the literature, and have, it's really an iterative process that way, right? And of course, when I say blissfully ignorant, it's also, we cannot be ignorant because we have theories, we have ideas, we have gone through doctoral studies, we've maybe been professors in this field for a while, we know a lot of things about the literature already. So we cannot be, we already come to the world with theories about organizations. Even young doctoral students, right, will come into a field site with ideas about organizations based on either what they read in literature, but also maybe their prior ideas. So I think we will never leave our theories behind. And I don't think it's wrong. You know, I think that the questioning and what you're doing of going between your data and towards the theory is very much the right thing to do. I'm just saying, I'm just giving this as a kind of simple rule, and maybe something that's a little counterintuitive, that actually I think that we can also become too steeped inside of the literature. Okay. And this is also, I think, where sometimes when our research question moves into a domain area we might not know something about, you know, it's not always a bad thing, because sometimes we can actually thus be forced right into a domain area that we don't know so much about, and where we thus might not have as many kind of preconceived ideas.
Thank you very much, Stine. There's another question in the chat, and our participant is struggling with the technology to raise their hand, but I think it is pretty much an easy question. If you may, I will put it forward. Is it all right to come back to your informants after starting coding? So you started coding, you think there is something interesting, and is it methodologically correct to come back to them with additional questions to clarify, or is it a kind of cheating?
No, and not at all. I think it's very important. I think actually we do this too little just because it's sometimes difficult to do and unpractical. But I think this iterative relationship between collecting data, analyzing it, coming up with new ideas, going back to informants or other kind of data that we are collecting and collecting more data, I think is the way that we really learn deeply about the thing that we are trying to do. So I'd actually encourage that and say the more you can do that, the better. And thus it can be good to collect a part of your data set and then learn that, analyze it before you collect more data. So when I said about collecting a big data set in the beginning, I didn't mean that it all had to be collected right at the same time. We can collect a smaller sample, understand what's interesting there, and then guide our data collection process over time. But that at the end of the day, we need to have a very strong data set in order to really create a really big paper. Okay, I'll move on also for the sake of time.
Thank you.
So now I'll move on to 5 simple rules about theoretical models. So I think that theoretical models, for me in my research process, is extremely important. This is just personal. I'm a visual person. I like to work with models. To me, it's a way that we can simplify and capture the ideas that we as a research team have about the evolving nature of our theory. And so I see really that theoretical models is this boundary object, right, between the data and the theory, something that represents and moves between these two levels. It's also, in my process, a boundary object between co-authors. So when we're working on the model, we also all trying to be on the same page, everybody who's on the team, and working together on the paper. Because when we look at the model, we can all say, okay, this is where we are. These are the ideas that we have about where our paper is actually going. And so we are on this, we have a collective understanding about what we believe is going on in the data at that point in time. And thus working on the model happens throughout the data analysis process. It's not just an afterthought that happens at the end. It is actually the core of what we are doing. We are working. It is when we are constantly analyzing data, looking at the data, and questioning the model. Can this model represent the data? And going back and forth with that allows us, every time we meet a quote, we come up with a quote, we look at an action, something's happening in our data that cannot be explained inside our model. We know our model is wrong and that we need to update it, right? Or we have the model, but it doesn't seem to explain the behavior. So this iterativeness back and forth is happening throughout the data analysis process. When people create models, I think that one of the most important things is that your outcome is on the figure. And this thing about outcome, I also think is very important. I know that in qualitative research, a lot of people advocate that you have to think about what is your case, what is this a case of, right? What is your data a case of? And I've realized that I find that language a little bit confusing at times, because I often find that whatever my data is a case of many things, right? So let's say nanotechnology, it's a case of a high technology area. It's a case of a high technology. It's a case of a government funded area. It's a case of a commercialization of science. And so when I ask this question, what is this a case of? I can be slightly confused sometimes. What is helpful for me is to think about what's the outcome I'm trying to explain. So what is it actually you're trying to, what is the puzzle, what is the thing, the outcome you're trying to explain? For example, is your outcome, for example, professional identity? So you're interested in people's professional identity, and that is the outcome that you're trying to explain. Then the outcome has to be prominently displayed on a figure, and you then have to develop your model that explains that outcome, right? And all of these boxes and arrows that you create are something that will help you explain this outcome over here, which could be professional identity. And so thinking about this and asking yourself the question, what is the outcome that I'm trying to explain? Is it professional identity? Is it, for example, social and symbolic boundaries? Is it progression on a grand challenge, right? Like, what is that outcome? Is it right, the willingness to work from, to go to the office or work from home, right? So maybe if you're interested in people working from home, you could say, well, my outcome is, do people decide to work from home or do they go to the office? And now I'm going to then that has to be prominently displayed here, the outcome, and you will then develop your model of what are all the mechanisms that drive that outcome here, right? So here's just some examples, right? This is from my ASQ paper. The outcome is the social and symbolic boundary, and they're prominently displayed here on the model, and in the middle are the mechanisms that explain some of them. Or here's from my AMR paper on the co-evolution of categories and technological designs. And so we have on the one hand categorical evolution, and the other hand technological evolution, and we detail what are the mechanisms that affect this over time. Or here's another model that we're working on at the moment about professional identity. And so professional identity is in the middle and it evolves over time. And the two things we are interested in is professional expertise and client relationships. And so we explain those over time. But having your outcome and knowing what is the outcome that I'm trying to explain, I think is also related to the thing about the puzzle, right? What is the puzzle? What is the puzzling behavior in the outcome I'm interested in? And that becomes the focus, and everything I do tries to explain that outcome. In a model, another problem I find that people have in models is that they're too close to the data. They become too descriptive, right? And so I have a golden rule, which is that you cannot mention the empirical context in your model. There cannot be a single word that is unique to your context in the model. Because if you have this rule, it will force you again up to a level of abstraction, away from the data and towards something that is actually theoretical. For example, in a study of the professional identity of medical doctors, we cannot mention medical doctors. We cannot mention something like the National Science Foundation. Those are things that are unique to our context, right? We are not developing a theory of medical doctors. We are developing a theory instead of professionals. The medical doctors is an instantiation of the theoretical category professionals. And so our theoretical model has to say professionals because it's decontextualized. The same as we cannot mention the National Science Foundation. It's unique to our context. Instead, we have to talk about something like a peripheral community. Something we need to name that. What is it? What is this entity doing? And how can it abstract to other contexts? Because only by doing that, we force ourselves to develop our theories at levels that are actually generalizable to other contexts instead of just being unique to our context. So forcing yourself to do this, I think, is also really important while you're working on your models throughout your research process, because it will help you sharpen your theoretical contribution and be at the right level of analysis instead of being too descriptive. As I said, I have seen many qualitative papers that become too descriptive. They're too close to the data. The models describe maybe in interesting ways what took place in that data, but it's not generalizable because the concepts that are used are of this kind, right? They are they are specific to the context, and they're not abstract theoretical constructs that we can generalize across. Then a third simple rule is aim for theoretical simplicity, right? And so here, the thing is that in qualitative research, as I also heard from some of the comments, some of our biggest problems is complexity. There's so much going on in our data, and we want to explain all of it. However, in any single paper, and to convey a theoretical insight to the reader, we have to create something that's fairly simple. We have to just think about the fact that in our data, there's not just one paper. There are many papers. There may be hundreds of papers inside any single data set. And what we are trying to convey here is just one idea, right? And so we'll aim to try to make our model as simple as possible while still being able to account for the main dynamics in the data. So it can't be just completely simple, because it has to account for a dynamic. But if we have an opportunity to reduce complexity, we will aim for it. We will always try to reduce complexity. See how simple can we make our model in a way that it still accounts for the main dynamics that are happening inside of our data, because this is also a way where we get to work at the theoretical level. Often a theory that is simpler is more easy to abstract and to move across contexts, and to actually be generalizable into other settings than our own. And then another golden rule is that you cannot have boxes as arrows without labels. So you cannot have, oftentimes I see models, and they, for example, have a relationship between two things, right? As here, as for example, here, the symbolic boundary and the social boundary. And there's an arrow, but it's not named. I don't know what this is. What is this, right? What's going on here, right? In order to have a theory, I cannot just go from this to this without something. There needs to be an explanation of every single element in your model. There has to be, each of these boxes has to have a name. Normally that happens, but I often see arrows without a name. So for example, here, it could be core communities associate new members. There's a mechanism there. There's something that happens when we move between the social and the symbolic boundary. We have to label all of these, because this again forces us to develop our theory. It forces us to ask ourselves, I drew this arrow, I feel these two things are related, but what's the mechanism? If I believe X and Y are related with an arrow, what is that mechanism? I need to go into the data and try to figure that out, try to find out what does that arrow actually represent. And last but not least, very importantly, is that there is a one-to-one correspondence between the model and the paper. What do I mean by that? It means that you cannot have a box or an arrow on your figure that doesn't correspond to a section inside your paper. So everything that's in your model has to have some kind of header inside your paper. So I can easily go from the model into the paper and say, this is exactly where you talk about that element of the model. But also, there cannot be a section of the paper that's not on the model, because then the model is missing something, right? And so when I'm writing a paper, I begin by creating the model. And then for everything that's in the model, I create a header, So every box, every arrow, they have a header, a blank piece of paper, and everything has a header. And then I write that out. And when I wrote that out, I might feel there's something missing in the story, in the narrative. There's something that I really want to write here. I can't just write this narrative because something's missing. I want to put in a section about something, right? I need to put in a section about, let's say, mobilization of a social movement, because that was really important. Then I realized, well, then that's missing in my model. That's super important in my narrative. It's because something's wrong with my model. So then I have to change my model. And then I change my model around. And once I change my model, I go back to the paper to put in the new sections, the new things I had in my model. I try to write those into my paper. And that way, the writing process is just back and forth between the model and the paper. But the paper is not written from some kind of scratch, blank paper, piece of paper I just start writing and typing. No, it has a structure. Once I have my model, I put all of those headers into the paper and write it up. right? And try to say, is there something missing? And also because this makes you really accountable to your theory, right? If you're not allowed to have a section in the paper that's not in the model and vice versa, right? It makes you really accountable. Also, you cannot have something in your model where you don't have data, where you don't have quotes, you don't have something you need, because if you have a section in your paper about it, of course it needs to have quotes, right? We cannot have that there is a there is a data theory gap. Every single element in the paper needs to support it by data. I mean, my golden rule for that is also that every single section, every mechanism, for example, needs to have 1 to 2 quotes. There has to be 1 to 2 or things from the data where I show this thing. And if you don't have that, if you can't find all of those things inside of the data, something is wrong in your theory. Every time you come with a statement, you have to have data to support it. There has to be a way where you show the reader, this is how it happened. And you have tables that also support that. This is where you can see all of these things going on in my data. And it creates an accountability to yourself that forces you to develop a better theory, right? Because you're not just writing a narrative and then develop a model and two are very loosely connected. No. The things are very, very tightly connected, right? So the golden rules, the 5 simple rules about theoretical models is that your outcome is centrally displayed on the figure. There's no mention of the empirical context. You have to aim for theoretical simplicity, and there's no boxes or arrows without labels, and there's this one-to-one correspondence between the model and the paper. I realize that we don't have so much time, so I'll go through the next 2 rules, and then I will take questions afterwards. So you can just always stay after the presentation if you have more questions, and I'll be happy to answer them there. But I just want to make sure that we actually get through the presentation in the time that we have allocated. So the 4th area that I want to talk about is the 5 simple rules about framing qualitative papers. And so framing is very difficult, right? It's part of the data theory death trap, right? That the death trap is that the literature is endless. No matter what you're writing about, no matter how small you think that theoretical area is, I'm sure that there's an endless amount of literature written that actually is somehow relevant for the thing you're studying, right? If we're interested in identity, we can read about identity, in management, but there's also psych literature, there's sociology literature, there's many different studies, and you could be reading from now on until you retire on identity. There's so much to be read already. So what are you going to do? Because the literature is endless. How are we going to have a take on this? And so this can be really difficult when we try to frame a paper. And so there's some simple rules that I have about doing that. Is that first of all, that each paper can only have one idea. So it's important that even though in your data you see many different things, there's both maybe identity, then there's work-family boundaries, then there is contestation and conflict, there's power and politics, there may be many things going on. But in any given paper, you can only have one idea. So there has to only be, one big insight. And if you have more than one idea of a kind of really big things you want to say, then you have more than one paper, right? So that's a good thing. But it's a fallacy to think that always having more ideas inside the paper is better, because it makes the paper incoherent and it's difficult to know what it's about. There's too much going on, right? This is one of the most common responses that people get on their papers, is that your paper, there's too much going on. There's too many ideas. You need to focus in on one big idea that you're interested in exploring and focusing on that. And then also that the contribution of your paper should be primarily to one literature. You should frame it as a contribution to primarily one literature and find out what is the dialogue you're having with that one literature. And again, here, more is not necessarily better. You might think that, it's better if I say this paper actually, has a lot of things to do with identity and then power and politics and work home boundaries and gender relationships, but that just makes your paper confusing. You need to choose what it is your paper is mostly about, and be in conversation primarily with one literature, not only one literature, but primarily with one literature. Can maybe a very difficult choice to make, but again, this, less is more. It's better to have a more focused paper with fewer literatures than to have a paper that's confusing. And so this also means that you can build the gap in one literature only. Stating many gaps in multiple different literatures does not make it paper stronger. It makes it more confusing. And so if you're saying, well, this paper adds to a gap in the identity literature, and then people also there's also this gap in gender relationships that it adds to, and then there's how people use technology at work. Also, there's also a gap here, and we're also filling that gap. That also means that you cannot, because a paper is only 40 pages, you cannot develop all of those gaps in great details. So your paper becomes superficial and just kind of just driving across and pointing to different things instead of unfolding and unpacking something in great detail. So you should focus on the kind of mostly focusing in on just one big gap in the literature, in that one literature that you want to contribute to. And I think that the most powerful papers are framed around the outcome that you're trying to explain in the data. And this is where your model, identifying the outcome on the model, is important also for framing your paper, because if the main outcome you're trying to explain is, let's say, gender relationships, then you will also know that that's your literature, So if it's if your main so if your outcome on your model is, let's say, gender identity, okay, then the main literature that you're contributing to should be gender identity, right? And this is where deciding that outcome, developing the model, is also really important for narrowing in and figuring out what is actually the main literature you're in conversation with. You're in conversation with that literature that's related to the outcome that you're trying to say. I'm not saying that you can never write a paper about one of the mechanisms, right? You can do that, but it's more difficult, especially if you have then, let's say you have gender identity and you have 3 different things that you show affects gender identity, and you're framing it around one of those things. Well, the question becomes, why are you framing it around that third mechanism, and not the 2 first ones, right? Since they're also important, right? Why are you giving primacy to one over the other? So framing a paper around the outcome to create a more powerful paper. And to force yourself, you should be able to state the contribution of your paper in one sentence, or at least I would encourage you to work very hard on the abstract together with working on the model. What I work on throughout the research process is the abstract, because if you cannot write the abstract for your paper, you cannot write the paper. The abstract is a mini version, a prototype of your paper. So working on your abstract early on throughout the process and just saying, what's the abstract here? What is the main, because in the abstract you'll say, this is the literature, this is the gap in the literature, this is the research question, and this is the contribution, right? This is what the abstract does. And working on just writing those 10 sentences, that is a much more doable job, and that will keep you on track instead of working on the big paper with 40 pages that you get lost in the text, right? So working on the abstract, working on the model, is a kind of mini version, a little prototype of your paper, will keep you grounded in what you're actually trying to do. And then the last thing I want to talk about is 5 simple rules for writing up qualitative research. So in order to, again, avoid being trapped in this data theory trap and this overwhelmingness of the literature, what I do is that I try to begin to say, okay, I'm overwhelmed by the literature, but let me just try to identify 5 core papers that are in my which are in the vicinity of the paper that I'm trying to write, right? These papers are, in the best scenario, these 5 papers are in conversation with each other, and they're published within the last 10 years in the top management journals. Or you can say they're in a conversation with each other and they're published within the last 10 years in the journal that you would like to publish in, right? Wherever you want to publish, find 5 papers that are in conversation with each other in that journal. You need to join a conversation that is happening around the journal. And also now our task is all of a sudden much more specific, and we can become much more in-depth about what our contribution is. So what is this? I spend a lot of time with these 5 papers, and I try to ask, how is my model and the things that we are trying to do, how is that different from what these 5 papers are saying? If those 5 papers was all the literature that was in the world, it was just these 5 papers, what would my contribution be, right? Because this will allow you to at least begin to sharpen, because in those 5 papers, most of the thoughts that went before will be incorporated into them, right? These will be, and since those are, you've chosen those because they're related to the thing you're doing, they will at least begin to bound the literature and to bound your contribution. And when you can then try to become very specific, right? About, okay, my paper is actually different from those 5 papers on this area, right? These areas, I seem to see this and they say that, right? Like the paper on professional identity, we are focusing on client relationships and what is the role of client relationship in relationship to expertise. And so you begin to think about, we seem to focus more on client relationship, the literature seems to focus more on expertise. And then because then you have narrowed in what your contribution is, and then the amount of literature you then need to survey is actually much smaller. Then my next golden rule is to try to copy the structure exactly. So this means that try to identify a paper that's published in the journal you like to publish in, and that is similar to yours. Let's say if yours is a multiple case study, find a paper that's a multiple case study. If yours is a process paper, try to find a process paper. And then try to copy the paragraph structure of this paper. I mean, I'm not advocating copying the text. This is not about plagiarism. This is about the structure of the paper. Begin to read that paper and understand what happens in the first paragraph of the paper, what happens in the second paragraph, in the third paragraph of the paper, right? Where do they problematize the literature? Where do they state the gap? Where do they summarize the findings, right? In this way, you can learn to write a paper for that particular journal. And it's not like you are not reinventing the wheel. You can actually look at this model paper and say, okay, they wrote a paper that fit into this journal. I'm going to create a paper that looks like it in the kind of structure of this paper. And then begin to think and read this paper in terms of its structure. What is it doing, right? What's happening in the front end? How they're writing up the method section? How are you writing up the discussion, right? And even though this might differ, right, between different journals, then I think that problematizing the literature in or before the third paragraph is also a golden rule that I have. You want to problematize the literature really quickly. Often when I see qualitative papers being written up, people wait along, they want to review the literature and say a lot about what's been happening before they get to problematizing and saying what is their contribution. But this actually has to come really early, sometimes even in the first paragraph, where you begin to say shortly what other people have said, and then you begin to problematize it, and you get into a discussion. Remember, the front end of a paper is not a literature review. It is an argument. You are presenting an argument for your case. And so it's important that you think about it that way. Your task is not to review the literature. Your task is to argue for this gap in the literature and for the importance of your particular theoretical perspective. And as I said before, when we think about writing up the findings section, we will write that up as a one-to-one correspondence to our theoretical model. We will writing the method, the finding section in that sense is simple, because if we have stabilized our theoretical model, that finding section will actually mirror our theoretical model completely, and we'll have a one-to-one correspondence. Discussion sections, I think, are some of the most difficult things, difficult part of a paper to write, because there's kind of more of an open-endedness about what you can say in a discussion section. But so in order to get a little bit of structure onto that finding section, discussion section, I like to divide it into 3 different parts and say, okay, let's find 3 big areas that we want to contribute to. And the first one has to be the main literature that we are contributing to. The first part of the discussion section has to engage with that main literature where we stated the gap and that we problematized in the beginning. We'll have a section on that. I also like to have then that the second section is what I call the auxiliary literature. Oftentimes we can write a paper where we build a gap in the main literature by bringing in a perspective from another literature. So I might, for example, problematize the management literature by bringing in the literature from psychology or from sociology, something that people haven't considered. Then that auxiliary literature can be something I discuss in the second section. And then the third area can then be something that is kind of more open-ended. It might be related to your context. If you're studying open innovation, it could be open innovation. If you're studying corporate social responsibility, you could discuss corporate social responsibility. But at least this gives a structure, and also divides the discussion section into big parts so that it's not also all over the place. Because sometimes discussion section can just state a lot of facts and there's no coherence. Again, it's about building something in depth and not just stating a lot of contributions to multiple different literatures. So just to kind of sum this up, then the 5 different rules that I've talked about in these presentations are, first of all, I want to caveat again that these are heuristics, also that they are not generalizable to everybody, but they're kind of my personal process and things that have helped me, right? That is, first things about designing qualitative studies, the process of doing qualitative analysis, doing theoretical models, framing papers, and writing them up. And so the first 5 rules are about design, and you have to choose the right method for your question, qualitative and quantitative, based on whether you want to do theory building or theory testing. Identify the type of paper you're writing. Is it a process paper or a variance paper? Is it a multiple case study, or is it a comparative case study? Collect data with variance. Try to find data so that you have some variance, some interesting ways to contrast things inside of your data. If you can collect data that allows for triangulation between, let's say, ethnographic observations, interviews, archival data, will make your data stronger. And mostly collect a lot of data. The data is the foundation of the house that you're trying to build, of the paper you're trying to write. And then the 5 simple rules about the research process is that start by reading through your data to find out what's puzzling. If you start by open coding, you might be overwhelmed by all the codes that you generate. You need to narrow in on the thing that is puzzling and interesting in your data. And that will become the focus. Also work on the theoretical model throughout the research process. Whenever you read through your data, when you're coding your data, keep asking yourself, how does this add to the model that I'm trying to develop? Then use directed coding to elaborate and question and update your model. So you're constantly coding to question your model. Is this true or not? Am I seeing this actually inside my data? Is the thing in my model correct? Do I need to update it based on the things that I'm now learning about my data? And stay blissfully ignorant of the existing literature. It might be that it's better to just only know a little about the literature and develop your model. And once you have the model, go back to the literature and see how is your model different from the literature. Once you know about the literature, you can then go back maybe and ask new questions and begin this iterative process between the model and the literature. And most importantly, be willing to forego your initial beliefs. Qualitative research is about following the data. I'm a big believer in empirical work. I'm a big believer in that the biggest insights that we get them through our data, from our context, from our informants. And that necessitates that we need to forego whatever we thought we were going to study. It might be we wanted to go into the data to study something, corporate social responsibility, but we'll end up studying something else because that's in our data. And the 5 simple rules about theoretical models is that you have to have that your outcome is centrally displayed on the figure. You have to remember not to mention your empirical context on the figure. It has to be all abstracted away from your context so that it's generalizable to another context. Try to aim for theoretical simplicity. A model that is simpler is better than one that's complex. You have to, of course, be able to account for your phenomenon, but it cannot be overly complicated. You cannot have a box or an arrow that is not labeled and that doesn't have a corresponding section inside your paper. Every single box, every single arrow has to be part of your theory, right? Has to be part of your paper. There has to be a one-to-one correspondence between the model and the paper. You have the model, everything that's in the model has a section in the paper and vice versa. If something's in the paper, it has to be in the model. Those two things has to be completely correspondent to one another. It'll keep you sharp. It'll keep you on your toes, right? It'll push you to make sure that everything you say and your model is actually supported by your data. And then the 5 simple rules about framing a qualitative paper is that each paper can only have one big idea. More ideas is actually worse. Frame your paper around one big idea that you have in your data. And that the contribution of your paper is therefore mostly to one literature. Find that one literature you want to contribute to. And you can only build one gap in the literature. Having multiple gaps often makes your paper confusing. You have to choose. It's difficult to do, but make that hard choice. What is the biggest gap you're filling, and focus on that and develop it in greater detail. And the most powerful papers are framed around the outcome you're explaining of your data. So the outcome that's at the end of your theoretical model, that is also where you're trying to contribute. That's the literature you're in conversation with. And you should be able to state the contribution of your paper in one sentence. That one big idea, you have to state it really succinctly. Otherwise, you have maybe not pushed yourself enough. Lastly, 5 simple rules about writing up research. Try to identify your contribution to 5 core papers only, right? Find those 5 core papers that are most important to what you're doing, that have been published recently in the journals that you want to publish, be a part of a conversation in, and start by just figuring out, what is my contribution if these 5 papers were the only thing that has ever been written about this domain. Try to find an exemplar paper and copy the structure through which that was written exactly, right? How is it written? Study that paper and other exemplar paper for the structure. How were they written? And try to have your paper, at least initially, if you're a doctoral student trying to learn to do this, you can copy that structure exactly to learn how a paper is written. And problematize the literature early, often before the 3rd paragraph. You want to not have a literature review. You want to create an argument and show what is problematic with the way that the existing literature have thought about your topic, and map the finding section one-on-one onto the theoretical model. And then start the process of writing your discussing section by identifying 3 large areas of contribution. So try to say there's these 3 areas, and those are the ones that I'm going to contribute to. And so that was it, all that I had. But now I'm more than happy to take any questions. And I know for those of you who need to leave, feel free to leave. But I'm happy to stay on to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Stine, for these very constructive and very insightful set of tips and rules, so greatly helpful, and you've managed to explain this kind of great puzzle of academic life and academic process in a very structured way. So Thank you very much for this. I know there are many questions on this call, so I want to ask you for how much longer you will be prepared to stay with us, because this session has great demand, and it is a bit like qualitative research. The more we delve on the topic, the more questions are surfacing. So we probably need to restrict ourselves with the time.
Yeah, but I can stay on for a while. We'll see how the conversation goes.
All right, so we planned for 2 hours, so we still have about 20 minutes. We can go for half an hour. Is it going to be all right?
Yeah.
All right.
Well,
so,
I think we just let Stine go for as long as she would like to.
I don't mind. All right, so I'm just, I just have a feeling that. All right, so shall we go in the pecking order? Ricardo, you are the first in the line. Can you please unmute yourself and put your question forward?
Hello, thank you, and thank you, Stine, for so much wisdom you share with us. My question is, when we have a project that is primarily based on data collected from elite interviewing, although I love and identify with your process and these 25 rules, I ask myself if I should start, because I don't think I can be as iterative, prototyping my theoretical model, going back to data collection, going back to the field, if my study is not so ethnographic and primarily based on elite interviews that often happen only once, and I don't have a chance to go back to my informants. Thank you.
I mean, so you're asking about what can you do if you don't have this opportunity to go back to your informants? I mean, I think many people are in this situation. I actually think that most papers that are written based on interview data, people haven't gone iteratively back into the field, right? And so, in a sense, you have the data, that data that you have, right? And you'd have to work with that. But this is also why, if you believe that this will be the case, that you'll only be able to be in the field once before you pull out. This is where I say it's good to get a lot of data, because that will allow you the flexibility. If you have a lot of interviews, I'm sure that there will still be a lot of things going on in those interviews that will allow you to kind of switch your question around as you learn about what is actually puzzling inside of the data. So I wouldn't be discouraged just because you're not able to go back to the field site. I think this happens all the time, and I still think there's probably some really great and golden nuggets inside of your data.
Thank you very much. Next, Oscar. Oscar, can you please unmute yourself?
Yes. Hi, hello. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Many thanks for this presentation. That is quite very, very useful in many levels. My question is regarding you mentioned in one of the 5 tips that is the good papers are those that are paraphrasing you. Strong papers are framed about outcomes. It means they are mainly about the outcomes that you can fix into the literature as a contribution. My question is, why we cannot do good papers about mechanisms, just about outcomes?
I'm not saying you can't do a good paper about the outcome. It's just, I think, I mean, for example, I think when I was talking about the multiple comparative case studies, right? For example, Kate Kellogg's papers, where she has an outcome, but then she shows there's like this one mechanisms that really explains the outcome, right? Then a paper is actually framed around the mechanism. I think that oftentimes, let's say you have an outcome you're interested in explaining, and then you have multiple different mechanisms that explain that outcome, then the question becomes a little bit like, why are you framing your paper around one mechanism and not the other mechanisms? Let's say that you show that in order, the thing that drive people to work from home, okay, drive people to work from home is their relationship to their family members, is their gender identity, and is whether or not they have pets, or their relationship to their pets, or something like that, right? I mean, then these mechanisms is like, then you're framing it around people's relationship to maybe to their children, right? But then it becomes, if you're showing there many other mechanisms, what are those other mechanisms then doing inside of your paper? Then you have to have, like, the paper then needs to be one of those things, what I call the one big concept papers, right? Where there's one big idea, and this is the one kind of mechanisms that you're emphasizing, and it cannot be just one among many, right? I mean, I think that where I think people go wrong is that if they have a paper and they identify multiple different mechanisms, and then they frame it around just one of them, right? Then it seems esoteric or weird, right? Because you're then pulling one mechanism up over the others. So if you want to write around the mechanism, you need to make sure that that mechanism is like the one driving force throughout your finding section, right? In a sense, you have one mechanism, and everything in your finding sections is an elaboration of that one mechanism. Then I think it's good to frame around the mechanisms, but it just needs to be then an overarching element, and not not just one among many. Can you see the differentiation between that? That then the mechanism, if you, for example, it's about working, this thing about working from home, then, and the mechanism is gender identity, then everything inside the paper has to be about gender identity. All the mechanism, all the things that you show influence working from home have to be about gender and not about other things.
Right, thank you very much, Stine. Next in our line is Emmy. Emmy, can you please unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. This was so helpful, particularly for writing papers. And it's just that I'm also doing a PhD. And so it's a bit, there's more to it sometimes, right, in a PhD than in one paper. And so I have two questions. One is, grounded theory. It sounds like a lot of what your approach is comes from grounded theory. And can we also make models and have a contribution to theory if we didn't use grounded theory? Like I used IPA. So that's the first question. And then I have another one.
I mean, I think that there are multiple different ways to do qualitative research. And as I mentioned in the beginning, this is just the way that's worked for me. And it's definitely very inspired by grounded theory. And I think that there are multiple different methods to do that. Let's say, for example, I know that Kathy Arsenhardt has been talking about her multiple case study method, right? And there's so many different ways, right? We also have discourse analysis, and I think there are many different ways in which we can make contributions. This is just one. This is just trying to go into the different ways of writing papers and building papers that has worked for me in the kind of work that I do.
Okay. Yeah. So I think probably a model is still good in other methods too. Thank you. And so the other question is, it makes so much sense to just have the one big idea per paper, because this is what I struggle with also in my PhD, that there's, would you also kind of advise for that in a PhD? In a qualitative study, is one big idea in each qualitative study as well to try and narrow it? Or do you have any advice about, because it's so much in a PhD?
Now, of course, to write a dissertation at different universities, they have different requirements about what constitutes a dissertation. And so I'm a big proponent in this day and age in management for people to write 3-paper dissertations, right? Because if you write, I don't know if you're being asked to write a monograph, but I think that if you write 3 papers, then you at least, maybe they are not ready to be sent off, or they're not ready to be published right there, but you at least one step along the way, if your dissertation consists, let's say, of 3 papers or 2 papers or 4 papers, right? But that it's a paper-based dissertation, because the currency that most people need in order to build their careers is papers. And it can be difficult if you're writing a monograph to take that monograph. I wrote a monograph, and I had to spend a lot of time in the beginning of my career taking that monograph and trying to put it into a format that was actually a paper that I could publish. And so thus, I think, yes, they could have 3 papers, and each of those 3 papers have a big idea, right? And this is about also the fact that inside your data, there are multiple different papers, right? Focused on different elements of it and different ideas. And then you choose 3, for example, or 4 or 2, whatever, to focus on. And then there's maybe some overarching idea that kind of binds them together. But that's, of course, also very different depending on your advisor and the institution and what the requirements are. Just from my perspective, I think that is very advantageous to write your dissertation based on papers.
I think it would have been, but it's too late for me now. I have to make it the monograph and then the papers later. So yeah, maybe just try and keep it as focused as possible is the idea. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, and then even if it's a monograph, you might think about the different chapters in your dissertation being kind of a little bit paper-like. I've been seeing that too, right? That even if it's a monograph, you have themes, right? 3 different themes in 3 different chapters. There's an intro, and then there's 3 different chapters that deal with different themes, so that those 3 chapters can be more easily, converted into a paper. It's nearly like the finding section of a paper when you are on the other side of your PhD.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stine. And the next in the order is Clara. Clara, can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, so first, thank you very much for the great talk. I'm also writing a qualitative paper at the moment with a grounded theory approach. So the thing is, I'm wondering is what do I put in the appendix when I actually submit my paper? Because there's some things that, I don't know, that you cannot figure out after a qualitative paper is published. What does it need in the appendix that I really convince my reviewers that my model is really grounded, and even also convince quantitative scholars that I really have a very good contribution with my paper? Well, what do you hand in your appendix?
I mean, it's a choice about what you put in the appendix versus inside the paper, right? I think the most important thing is to show your data, right? I mean, to show people that you systematically went through your data and that all of the concepts that you present in your paper are represented in your data. And the format for doing that, right? A lot of people do these data tables, right? Where every single concept that's in your paper also have representative quotes to at least show that, okay, when I came up with this concept about gender identity, it was not just something that I, picked from thin air, but you can see here actually all the quotes in which informants inside of my data talk about gender identity, and my data thus is grounded. I mean, I like tables and figures. And so this depends also on the kind of data that you have. I mean, I do a lot of, use a lot of archival papers myself, archival data. And here I also like to track things over time. So to track the concepts that I see in my data, actually track them inside of the data so that I can show, look, it's just not me that says that people in the beginning were very contesting what is a light cigarette, and later on they were not. No, I show you here actually in the data a graph that says here's contestation, this amount of contestation about light cigarettes in the beginning of the time period, and in the later time period there was no contestation. All right, but I mean that can only be done. I think that quantifying qualitative research can only be done for ethnographic interviews and for archival data, in my opinion. Whereas if it's I don't know if you've mostly interviews, then it cannot be done. But I think that the most important thing to convince readers and other people of the validity of your findings is to make sure that there is no data theory gap, right? I see this in a lot of papers. There's a gap between people saying, oh, I showed XYZ, but there's no data, there are no quotes, there's no groundedness. I can't, you say that you have this concept that is contestation, but I've seen no quotes about people contesting anything, right? You need to, if you claim that contestation is a big part of your finding, you need to show me those quotes that shows that to me as a reader, because then your paper becomes believable, right? And this is where I think it's about also being very rigorous, right? And also being very specific and systematic, right? Qualitative research is also about being very systematic and being very detailed about what you're trying to do and the relationship between your data and your theory. So the more you can do that in tables, right, or in figures, showing maybe, for example, your data collection in a figure, what happened at different points in time, which data was collected there, maybe representative quotes at different points in time. I don't know. The more you can do of this, I think the more believable, the more details you provide, so that I feel this is authentic. I can sense she was there, and that she knows that those and that the conclusion that she makes is actually based on the data.
Thank you. That really helps.
Thank you very much. And we are moving to the next question. Valeria, can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay. Thank you very much, first of all, for the presentation. This is the second time I attend. I also attended the one about the previous one about the data, like managing making sense of your data, and it was also super interesting. I have a question that is probably more of a, I don't know, let's think together about this, because I don't know if there's any solution to this. But I think when you say about, finding what's puzzling in your data before going into the in-depth analysis and really like reflecting about what's not normal in your data, I think there is an assumption there that you already know what's supposed to be normal, right? And I just finished my PhD, and I had this problem throughout, and I'm still facing this problem because I'm not super already knowledgeable in like all the literatures that I'm interested in, right? So I have to start reading somewhere in order to gain an understanding of what has been done before and what is still hasn't been done, or what are the gaps. But then I fall into the trap of knowing too much, right? So I don't know what the order or what suggestion would you give to someone approaching a new project from scratch in terms of, how can this person know how much they need to know and what they need to know before actually starting to analyze their data?
Yeah, I think, I completely understand what you mean about, well, can I know what's puzzling if I don't know the literature? Because if I need to know the literature to know what's puzzling. However, sometimes the puzzles that I'm talking about, they're not always just theoretical puzzles. They can also be empirical puzzles. For example, the puzzle that I mentioned, that nanotechnology firms that do nanotechnology say they're not nano, or non-nano firms say they're nano. I mean, this is not based on a theory, right? It's just, practically, empirically, just weird, right? I mean, just from a common sense perspective. And the same goes, I have this paper on light cigarettes. And the light cigarette paper, the way that started was just that we realized that light cigarettes over time began to have a lot of tar and nicotine, even though a light cigarette is supposed to be low in tar and nicotine. However, over time, light cigarettes, some of them at least, had more tar and nicotine than full flavor cigarettes, right? I mean, that's just weird, right? It's just puzzling from a more kind of just practical, pragmatic perspective, just as a commonsensical thing, right? That we should expect a light cigarette to be low in tar and nicotine. That's why it's light, right? Versus a full flavor one. So there's this empirical puzzle, something that seems just weird from a commonsensical perspective. And that thing is what drove the theory over time. It was not that the theory came before. For example, in both of these cases, my work started with empirical puzzle, something I thought was weird inside the data, something that I couldn't really figure out, right? And sometimes, for example, I have a paper also on helping behavior, and there we're interested in helping behavior, and our puzzle really started with things like we had difficulties coding the helping behaviors because we were trying to find a help giver and a help seeker, but we couldn't figure out who was the help seeker and who was the help giver in many of these interactions. It was, it seems as though the help giver and the help seeker, those roles were somehow blurred, and this caused us a lot of headache. for a long time until we realized that that is the puzzle. That is, you know, this is the thing. That's the thing that's going on, and how is actually these helping behaviors enacted, and the thing that actually this that the literature has made this distinction between help givers and help seekers, but actually out in real organizations, it's not like that. Right. So thus, I think that you don't need to know the literature to find things that are puzzling. The puzzle can also be what I call an empirical puzzle. It's something that's just empirically puzzling from a commonsensical perspective that stimulates your curiosity, where you're thinking, weird, I wouldn't have thought that, you know, like that's kind of odd. Right. And actually from then on, you might build the theory and figure out what does this actually say about our theory.
Okay. Just one last thing is, I mean, that makes perfect sense. So I now have a better understanding of what you mean by puzzling. But also, I think that when you go collect the data in the first place, so to work with the empirical material, you know, also going to do the interviews has a little bit of like pre-work, right? You enter the field with something to ask in mind. So how do you manage that stage of asking the right questions, let's say, without, you know, going deeply into the literature? So you just keep your questions very high level and then maybe narrow it down later.
Yeah, well, not high level, because you also ask just about what's going on in people's life, right? Or in the context you're interested in. So I think you actually want to be detailed in your questions, and you want people to give a lot of examples about what they actually how their work is unfolding, and how their organization is unfolding, or how the market you're interested in is unfolding. So actually, I think we do enter and should really enter the field with a general research question, something that guides us. We need to be guided by something, but it's just important that we also allow ourselves to change that focus when we learn about it. So I don't think it's problematic, and I actually think we need to go into the field with some kind of interest in something or theoretical sensibility about something. But we just don't need to know everything there is to know about this topic, right? And then we need to listen. Qualitative research is also, it's about listening to our informants and paying attention and figuring out what is actually going on here, right? Being open-minded and trying to make sense of this, and all the time being aware, right? You should have this critical mind, or your mind should constantly be roaming and ask yourself, like, what's interesting here? What's going on here? What are these people actually doing, right? Let's say, right, I'm interested in diversity training, right? And I'm interviewing all these people who do diversity training and people who participate in diversity training. And, you know, I need to ask myself, like, why are people doing this? Or what's the outcome? Or why do people participate in diversity training, right? And what are really the outcomes? What do people do after they went into diversity training? I mean, so I'm constantly trying to be curious about this topic and probing, right? Trying to look for those golden nuggets and for those things that are puzzling or weird, right? You know, like, well, do people actually change their behaviors after they've been in diversity training, right? I mean, it's just, instead of just assuming, you know, instead of just assuming that they're working, or it may be that I went into this interest in diversity training, but I realized the really interesting thing going on in the organization I'm studying is power and politics. It's about how there's maybe a powerful, some powerful people in the organization that are just deciding what everybody has to do. And then I need to go with that, right? You know, oh my God, this power dynamics is really interesting and not what I was expecting in this organization that maybe claims to be very egalitarian. But then when I look inside it, I see it's very hierarchical. And what's going on with this relationship between, right? And so I have maybe to abandon diversity training, and my paper needs to focus then on that thing, right? The relationship between an image of egalitarianism and then this hierarchical structure inside of the organization.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stine. I apologize, I had a technical issue. I dropped off from the call, and when I rejoined, I think the order is reshuffled. So I mean, I will go in the order that is on my screen. So for you, it might seem like a random order, but it's not my preference. So next on my screen is Cenk. Cenk, can you please unmute yourself and put your question forward? Apologies for the frustration who were expecting to be next. Honestly, I cannot restore. Zheng?
Is it Zheng Wang?
Zheng Wang, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's me. Sorry, I can't recognize the pronunciation at first.
Apologies.
Yeah, thank you very much for your sharing. I find it very helpful, but I'm a little confused by one tip that says no mention of the empirical context. For example, now I'm developing a qualitative paper, and my context is about the supply chain. So the actors in the empirical context is supplier and the focal company. So I suppose that it may be make sense that I keep the actors. So at this situation, I wonder that if it is appropriate to keep the empirical context. But furthermore, if I want to generalize the supply chain to the inter-organizational study, I wondered if it is appropriate to generalize my result.
I mean, when you say specific to your context, I think that you can use a word like supplier, right?
Yeah.
That's a general concept that generalizes across a lot of different contexts, right? I mean, we have suppliers in all, not just in your context, but everywhere else, right? And supply chain. I think that's not specific to the context to say supplier, supply chain, right? Specific to the context would be if you named the organization, right? You know, like when AB Supply, you know, like they did X, right? You know, so this kind of naming the specific organization, right? Or it could be that they are like, I don't know, microelectronic suppliers, right? You'd say microelectronic suppliers. No, the general level would be to mention suppliers, right?
Yes. Yeah, it makes
so
sense.
Suppliers and buyers, they're both at a general level. So I think that's perfectly fine to have those kind of concepts, right? Because your theory, I assume, is also about the relationship between buyers and suppliers.
Yes, and another question is about, because now I'm focusing on the supply chain corruption, but as you know, supply chain corruption is also a normal kind of private to private corruption, it's also inter-organizational corruption. So I wondered if I can generalize my results to inter-organizational corruption.
Because right now you're studying suppliers and buyers inside your organization.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it depends on, I mean, you'd have to, I mean, this is a question about external validity, right? And it would depend on whether or not you believe that there's something specific to this thing going on inside the organization that's different, right? I mean, for example, these units within the organization might be acting like like independent organizations. I mean, I think in all theory, it's even a question about boundaries of the firm, right? When do we actually claim something to be the same organization or not the same organization? When we have interorganizational networks and alliances, the blurring boundaries between organizations can actually happen. So this is in a sense this generalizability. Since I don't know enough about your data, I don't know if that's overclaiming, right? If these suppliers and buyers inside your organizations are acting very independently of one another, really like market players, they're not influenced by the overall organizational culture, it might be, but if they're still very much shaped by some overarching organizational identity or idea about working towards a common goal, then I don't think that it can generalize.
Okay, thank you for your answer.
Thank you very much, Stine. And we are moving forward. And the next in my line is Surabhi Jian. Surabhi, can you please unmute yourself?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor. I would like to ask my question through an example. So supposing I want to study how do stories create well-being for the reader, right? So basically I want to understand the mechanisms, right? And I rely on archival data from the net. And when we started engaging with the data, we realized that a lot of themes that were cropping up were related to well-being dimensions. For instance, the stories were triggering a memory. And that memory is actually it's proven in some other literature that when you engage with your memories, it leads to well-being. So there are certain other themes which are emerging. Now, the question which is very puzzling to why I'm intrigued is whether this project qualifies for a qualitative research, because the dimensions which are emerging are existing in the well-being literature. So should we proceed ahead with this qualitative project, or should we do a quantitative instead?
Well, I mean, I think you can do a qualitative theory building project with this, but of course you need to move the literature forward. So if you went into the literature and you found some categories, but those are being reflected in the existing literature, then you need to kind of go back to the data and then say, is there something that is not being represented in the existing literature, right? Is there something that's puzzling and something they wouldn't have thought? Maybe they've talked about memories, but is the way that these memories are being represented in your data set exactly the same way as they've been represented in the existing theory? Or is there something new that is happening, or something that you're seeing in the data that they didn't see? Of course, in order to do a theory building paper, you need to see something new. You know, if we're not seeing something that's not already in the literature, you know, we can't write a paper. And of course that happens sometimes. In the beginning of this helping paper, I talked about the first thing I really got fascinated by was the division of labor. But after I had developed a model around this, I realized I was just reproducing everything about the division of labor that was already in the literature. So there was nothing new there. And so we had to go back into the data and forge a new path and ask a new question.
Thank you so much. Just one thing more. Could you please give us some references which actually teach how to code, and what are the different ways to do coding to be able to analyze the paper, the data? So if you could share some references, because generally in a qualitative paper, that section is so brief and they just say that we coded and there's no elaboration. So if you could just share some references, they will be very helpful. Thank you so much for the session.
Yeah, I mean, so do you mean a theory paper that talks about coding? I mean,
yes, a methods paper. Yes.
Yeah.
Or even an empirical paper which lays out the methods in a little more detail.
Yes. I mean, in my last session and in my own paper in AMR, I try to detail some other different mechanisms for coding data that doesn't only focus on merging, which I think that merging codes together to kind of form these overarching questions have in general be the predominant way that qualitative research has been taught. But I think we also engage in a lot of other things, like this asking question, relating. I actually think relating different categories to each other is very important. So I can recommend that. I'm also a big fan of Eng and Langley's 1999 AMR paper on developing process theory. I think that also lays out a very nice groundwork. Also, one of the things he says that is important, and that I want to emphasize as well, maybe as another kind of tip, is this thing about creating a scaffold in the beginning of your research project. I also detailed that in my paper with Steve Carl on multi-level discourse analysis in SMJ, where the first step in the data analysis, there's this theoretical model, but actually I should maybe have emphasized this in the talk, I realize now, is also to try to create a scaffold over the empirics, right? A kind of a detailed map, for example, a timeline. What happens at different points in time? Or what do different actors do if it's cross-sectional? What are different actors doing and what are the things they are interested in? Creating a kind of an empirical map over your data, which also gives you a kind of first into an overview. And this is also about not getting lost, right? I mean, it's so easy for us to get lost within this data. Qualitative data, that having these kind of tools of way where we represent both in models and maybe in kind of creating these more empirical scaffolds is I think is also very useful.
Right, thank you very
you so
much. And I put those references in the chat. So thank you very much for the sources. Moving forward with the next. Hannah, you are the next in my list. Can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you very much. So Hannah, yeah, thank you very much for this your beautiful presentation. There's one thing I wanted to ask, maybe it might not be like one, if you look at the data collection quality, sometimes does it also depends on the subject area that you are doing. For instance, if you are doing qualitative research in maybe tax administration, where there's culture, laws, and regulations, and that means that you might need to do a lot of, maybe you do interview and be able to collect other forms of data to be able to support to verify the interviews.
I think the topic area very much informs the kind of data you can collect. I know that it's probably most common for people to use a lot of interviews to do qualitative research, but there are many topics that we cannot that's always very difficult for us to actually investigate using interviews. In my own work, for example, on the tobacco industry, we were not able to use interviews because nobody in the tobacco industry wanted to talk to us. They are, of course, very skeptical towards researchers, and they do not participate in research. So the only way that we were able to learn about the inner workings of the tobacco companies was through the release of the internal documents of a lot of tobacco companies that had been released both through whistleblowers and through the lawsuits that have been filed against tobacco companies.
Yeah, because I'm asking this question because the work that I'm doing, I used to also work in the tax office before, so I try to do it in the way that we do in the tax office. So it's like you looking at you are interviewing the person based on predetermined questions that and then you realize, and then you also want to look, whilst you are interviewing the person, like you said, you listen to the person and be attentive. And then you link what the person is also saying with the tax rules and regulations, which are the practices. So if the person says, my tax compliance is very high, then you ask yourself, what shows that the person tax compliance is very high in the rules and regulations? So in that case, by the law, it was tax clearance certificate, tax exemption, tax withholding exemption certificate, and those kind of certificates. So in that case, you have to have those documents to verify what the person is saying. In other times, if the person says, I use maybe what he says depends on, like, I use the technology to be able to educate people. That means you have to go to the website and monitor it for maybe several times. And then, so these are some of the things so that is why I'm asking you those questions. Because at the end of the day, my belief is that qualitative research is saying that the proof of the pudding is in the eating.
I mean, I think what you're doing is great, like relating both, the interviews to the laws and the regulations and looking at the intersections of that. And of course, it depends on the perspective, on the position of qualitative researchers. But I am of the opinion that, of course, we also need to be critical towards what people are saying, and also that people don't always have complete insight into their own actions. For example, what you're saying brings to mind a paper I did on email and stress, where when we interviewed people about technology and their levels of stress, they would say, I get so stressed out because I have so much email. Like, email is just the thing that stresses me out. I just have tons and tons of email, and it's always cluttering my inbox and makes me feel really stressed out. But then we also collected a lot of quantitative measures. We did surveys. They had these logs they filled out about their day and like what email they did and which phone calls they took and which meetings they were in. And in this paper, we actually showed that what made people stressed out was actually being in meetings. Because when the thing that happened was that they were in a meeting and they would come back to their office and then there'd be a pile of email for them to handle because they hadn't been able to do email when they were in the meeting. But they kind of projected their stress onto the email instead of associating with the meeting. So in that case, I don't think people had complete insight into their own, what was causing their stress. Actually, we were able to show in that paper that email was both a source of stress, but it was also simple. It became a symbolic element that showed to people their stress level. But actually, the meetings that people participated in was the main culprit of most people's.
Because when
right?
I look at it, we realize that in some of them, what they were saying and the realities were different. If you look at it from what I'm doing and the documents and the internal reports and those things, you realize that what they were saying were different from the reality. So you look at it and also look at the non-verbal cues and those things. Those things were those observations that are documented. And then that you use your judgment to be able to determine what is happening. Mm-hmm. So I can agree with you.
Yes, I mean, I actually think that's very interesting. Sounds like a great project.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you, Stine. Moving forward, and the next in the line, Manash Borach. Manash, can you please unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you for this beautiful presentation. I just wanted to ask something related to the work that I'm doing, and it's related towards networks for entrepreneurs. So in that respect, I'm trying to go for a interview-based study. So when you talked about going for triangulation, I'm trying to understand how to bring in triangulation in interview-based studies, and I'm trying to study networks. So I'm not finding any answer to that. If you can help me out.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so you're studying the network between entrepreneurs. Well, you could look, for example, at you could collect data about who of these entrepreneurs worked together before, right? I mean, you could, if they're I don't know if you're studying at the firm on the individual level, right? But at least at the firm level, you could easily study the
individual.
At the what?
Individual level.
Oh, the individual level. Yeah, you could have things that, I don't know if these people have written things before, or you could have data on who worked together with whom before, right? You could look at their LinkedIn profiles, right? Are any of them been at the same, create, for example, histories of, employment histories of all of these people. I don't know. It's also not that in all studies we are able to do triangulation between different data sources. I just think that it's a good thing to think about, right? Is there a way in which I can actually augment this? Let's say by using people's LinkedIn profiles to think about, who are they actually connect with. If you're doing are you doing ecocentric networks, right? Then you can look at who are they actually communicating with on LinkedIn, for example, right? Or another social media platform, which gives you some kind of sense of their social network in a different way from what they're actually saying.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I chip in, because there was a question on the YouTube from those who didn't manage to get a place due to the limits of the technology. There was a question: is it compulsory to have triangulation in a qualitative research or in a case study research? Because case study research is pretty much clear that data triangulation is one of the core methodological tools. So is it compulsory to have triangulation, and what to do when triangulation reveals that there is discrepancy? All right, so our informants either were not fair, all right, so or they were not informed, all right, so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to have triangulation. I mean, there are many studies where we can't have data triangulation because we only have one data source, right? We might only have interviews about something. We went in, I don't know, we have been interviewing, let's say, entrepreneurs, or, the work practices of people in the Amazon jungle, and they're not actually online. They don't leave digital traces. They're, we don't have other ways of maybe getting data than either interviews or maybe we can triangulate with ethnographies, but triangulation is not always possible. It's just if we can't do it, I think it's a really great thing to do, exactly for what you mentioned, that sometimes we realize that there's discrepancies. And this again, right, comes back to things that are puzzling. Those discrepancies can be really interesting and puzzling and can help us identify what is really interesting in our data. Because when we begin to see that when we triangulate, there's actually differences between things. Let's say in the case of the entrepreneurs, let's say you look at their LinkedIn profiles, in contrast that to what they actually say in their interviews, and you realize that, wow, I get a very different picture from people's LinkedIn profiles than I get from their interviews. Like, why is that? The people who said that I'm not very connected seem to have a lot of connections and they're communicating with a lot of people on LinkedIn, and the people say I'm very connected, right? This can raise a question for you, like, what is it? What is it about it? Why do people interpret? What do people then maybe mean about being connected? Do people have different perceptions about connectedness that leads them to say, I'm actually really connected versus I'm not connected, depending on some explanatory variable that you will find. So this is also why triangulation is important. It's not just for developing a greater robustness of our data, but it's again, we get to see the world in a different way. I always see it like that great story about the elephant and the 7 blind people, right? Where people are touching different parts of the elephant, and one person say, oh, it's a broom, and some says, no, it's a water hose, right? Because one is touching the trunk, another person is touching the tail. And it's only when they put all that information together that you realize, oh my God, it's actually an elephant. And so that is how having different perspectives into our data can actually really help us in terms of creating better papers, but also being puzzled and asking new interesting questions.
Thank you very much. I hope I've translated the question from YouTube correctly. And we are moving on with our line on the Zoom. And the next in the line is Fatima. Fatima, can you please unmute yourself and put your question forward?
Yeah, thank you so much. So my question is related to some work that I'm doing currently. So, and it relates to the 5 papers that you suggested that we take when we're writing the discussion. So the topic that I am working today is addressed from many theoretical lenses. Obviously, in my paper, I choose one lens on which like the whole paper is built. And now I'm asking, like, in the discussion, when I take those 5 papers from this one journal, should they be all from the same theoretical perspective on which my paper is built, or should there be some parsimony? Because in the same journal, authors are approaching the topic from many theoretical perspectives.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if they are all, addressing the same topic from different theoretical perspectives, I think that's, then you can incorporate some of all of those different perspectives, right? It doesn't have to be so, I mean, it's not so rigid in that sense. It's more to kind of give a starting point, right, for your discussion. You will also, of course, in your discussion section and your paper, draw on many other papers that have been written. So it's more seen as a kind of heuristic, as place to start if you feel overwhelmed by reading the literature. Maybe it's good to, I mean, you'd have to then problematize, so there's this, they are all explaining this one thing, but they're taking different perspectives on it. What happens when you bring those together, right? If you contrast them with each other, what happens? What can one explain and what can the other explain, and what are they not explaining? What is at that intersection, right? You need to begin to contrast them with each other, to ask questions about what are the underlying assumptions or what is happening in one versus the other.
Yeah, but even if like the whole paper is built on one theoretical perspective, so in the discussion I can't problematize, this is not an issue. Whether
you can problematize that is an issue. I mean, I find it interesting that there's this one thing, and that people have then looked at these very different ways of explaining it, right? I would totally problematize it in terms of saying, well, I mean, how can you integrate these, right? If there are all these different perspectives, are they not in communication with each other? right?
Yeah.
Are they just working in their own different silos and they're not actually cross-fertilizing across those silos? What is your opportunity for creating a kind of more integrated perspective that bridges these? And what is it? But it has to be grounded, of course, in your empirical study, right? This is important, right?
Okay.
It's important that the discussion is not just some kind of high-flying theory discussion, right?
Yeah.
The contribution you make needs to be grounded into the thing you actually showed, right?
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And we are moving on. And the next in my line is Bartuhi. Bartuhi,
Yes.
can you please unmute yourself?
Yes, I've just done it. Thank you, Dr. Potienko, Sergey, and thank you, Dr. Stine. Thank you so very much. Awesome presentation, very insightful, lots of great practical tips. So I'll get started with two very pragmatic questions. I have never conducted a qualitative study before. I am a quantitative type of person, but I am getting more and more curious, and listening to high caliber researchers like you, Dr. Grodal, makes it all more exciting to delve into a new method. So, okay, so my first question is very, very simple. What kind of software do you use to transcribe interviews?
Lately we've been using Otter. So what we do is like we first run it through Otter, which is an AI software that does automatic transcription. But I mean, it's not perfect, especially if people have accents. And so we then either pay people, or the PhD students would go through the interviews and the transcripts and clean it up afterwards.
Right. Thank you so very much. So this is a perfect segue into my second pragmatic question. So let's say you have transcribed your first 10 interviews. From what I remember from your first presentation, you gave us the tip to stop there and study your transcription of the first 10 interviews, give or take, to identify a puzzle, right? And then proceed with more data collection. Now, how do you study those 10 interviews? Is it a textual form that you print it out and sit in your comfy chair and read that, or maybe you listen to that kind of text on the software? Could you give us some pragmatic tips about that process?
I read them, but I mean, listening to them being read aloud by reading them, I think that depends on how you process information, right? Some of us are more visual and other people, are more auditory. So it's up to you. But I personally just read them through, right, on my computer, my iPad. I just sit there, read them through before we have a research meeting, right? And then, if you're doing it on your own, you're just with yourself. I personally love working together with other people. I think that qualitative research is done, I think actually all research is done really well in teams, because we bring different things to the perspective. And after having read those 10 transcripts, if I'm working with somebody else, we might not all have the same perspective on what was actually going on in the data. But then we would just read those through, kind of think about what's actually going on. What are they actually saying? Like, what is happening here, and what is kind of interesting? And then we'd meet and talk about that and try to figure out, well, the next 10 interviews, right? Should they be the same? Why do you want to have the same interview protocol? Or should you update them in some way based on what you've learned? What is it actually you want to focus in on? What is it? What is that puzzle? What is that thing that really seems to be unusual or counterintuitive in this particular context?
Appreciate that. And thanks for reiterating something that you've already mentioned the first time. I appreciate that very much. My very last question is a kind of, I don't know whether you're going to like it or dislike it, but I am interested in understanding whether there is a cross-pollination between people who are doing amazing work as qualitative research, or like someone like you who does both, and people who have only done quantitative work. So, for example, you have generated a theory about the nanotechnology companies and so on and so forth. So is there some subsequent research done by someone else who tends to work quantitatively, who uses a theory that has been generated via inductive methods to test that theory in the field? And if so, could you recommend us one or two papers that have done that, either by the author himself, him or herself, who has generated the theory, or by someone else who has drawn on a qualitative paper to test that theory in practice in the field, so to speak?
I mean, so for example, Kathy Eisenhardt's work on dynamic capabilities, right? There are many quantitative scholars that subsequently have done a lot of work on dynamic capabilities. I also know in my own work on helping behavior, where we found that helping often didn't happen in dyads, but in groups. Adam Grant has subsequently done experiments with some of his students where they were looking at helping behavior that was conducted in groups and not just in dyads. So I think it happens. I think, would I wish that it happened more? I do. I think there is a disconnect between the qualitative and the quantitative world? I think there is, right? And I think that it's the fault is maybe on both sides. And that is something that the qualitative community also needs to think about. Is there a reason that not all qualitative research is subsequently tested? I also think that part of the reason for that, though, is that qualitative research is very good at focusing on dynamics. How are things dynamically unfolding across time? And this is something that quantitative research is really bad at. Actually, it's nearly impossible with many of our current statistical methods to study dynamics. So quantitative researchers tend to study things that are cross-sectional. And a lot of qualitative researchers study things that are dynamic over time. There, I think there's a great marriage that Mike could make between qualitative research and simulation methods. That is a more quantitative approach, but that actually focuses on longitudinal areas. But there's a few papers like that that combines qual and quant, but it's not typical. So I do think that there is that relationship between the qualitative and the quantitative world. The bridge is not as dense and thick as we could maybe hope.
Understood. Thank you so very much. Appreciate that highly. And thanks so much also for your generosity, for the time that you have taken to sit through this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have quite a few people in the line, and I think considering that we've spent 2 hours and a half, can we please restrict ourselves to 1 question per person? That will be helpful for those who are still waiting for their questions to be answered. So next in my line is Samrat. Samrat, can you please unmute yourself and put your question forward?
Thank you, Professor Potiako and Professor Grodal. It's always such a pleasure to hear you. So part of my questions have been answered, so I'm just going to stick to 1 question. It was with triangulation. And part of it you answered through the presentation where you said, look for data which can be triangulated. I think that was a very key aspect for me because I've been trying to do that. Just to put a context, I just finished my coursework, ex-practitioner, and I kind of moved into qualitative because the question that I was trying to look at was novel. So I was preparing myself for quantitative, but I think the qualitative kind of, chose me to do it. Now, because of that, I am not really able to understand that when I do a thesis, which is more of a single person work, and I'm not at the liberty of having other fellow researchers or somebody else to triangulate my informations or my findings, specifically with coding, whether I'm doing it right or wrong. I just wanted to ask you if you can share some tips or advice, what I should keep in mind when I'm taking so much of data in terms of interview, as well as, so it's a multimedia, so I'm also looking at some of the public discourses being given. And often, the TMT CEOs, they differ a little bit on the public discourses and the interviews. So any advice from your side?
I mean, again, this thing I understand the difficulties of working alone and people working on their thesis primarily alone. I think it's much harder, right? Because you don't have those people to talk with. And so my first advice there is actually to develop a community. I think we underestimate the amount of learning we can have from our peers, right? When you're a PhD student, you might be looking to your advisor, to professors, but many professors are super busy and they have many projects, whereas your peers have a lot of time. So developing study groups around your dissertation where you help each other. And, that can be to talk through, doesn't have to be like read my paper. It can also be like, I'm working with this thing in my data. What do you think? What is interesting? I often feel that you spend an hour working on your own, or you spend an hour helping somebody else. What is the benefit that is generated, right? I'm sure that hour you helped somebody else was so much more helpful they make so much more progress, right? And so if that's reversed, right, another person helps you for an hour because they can see your study from the outside, you are also much better off. So by working together and getting that outside of input on your data, I think that is very helpful. So develop these study groups that actually you meet very regularly is also a way to keep you on track. Whereas in the PhD program, it's very easy to get lost, right? And time just kind of blends, and one day is like the other, and you get up, and if you're even working from home, like it's just like, you know, like days and months just pass by, right? Setting up some schedules and some meetings and creating an accountability. Now I'm meeting with my friend and they're going to give me some feedback. I have to present what I'm doing and hear what they think about it. I might even give them, you know, some quotes so they can look at those. So helping each other. So developing a network of other students that can help each other, I think is extremely beneficial because, you know, don't go it alone. I mean, our research, even on entrepreneurship, right, on creativity, on everything shows that people who work together in team tends to be more successful than people who are working solely on their own. So that's my first advice. Develop that kind of network of support and help that will help you, you know, succeed, because together you're stronger. You will all be better off working together than being alone. And so, but other than that, I think it's about looking for those puzzles, right? And then maybe also systematizing your data, right? It's also something, I mean, I'm a, you know, maybe here, like I like systematizing, right? I like creating kind of tables and overviews, right? And it's also a way of forcing myself to think very specifically and systematically about my data. And maybe sometimes that is also able to highlight some of those puzzles that might happen in the data. When you begin to think about, okay, what happened at different points in time? What are people saying there? What is people saying across different types of your data?
Absolutely. I mean, it's so easy. I mean, not easy, but at least in quantitative, you know, these are the approaches you can take to substantiate it. But in qualitative, the amount is overwhelming, the data which comes in. So then, you know, that's the challenge. Thank you so much for your time and this answer.
Thank you, Samrat. Thank you, Stine, and we are moving forward. Raja, it's your turn. Can you please unmute yourself and put your question?
Thank you so much, Stine. Awesome presentation. And Raja Roy from New Jersey Institute of Technology. And the question is, so in your 5x5 heuristic, where does the transition from first order finding to the second order finding occur? And is it only the second order findings that go into the theoretical model, or do you also include the first order findings?
Yes. I mean, so now you're talking the language of kind of traditional grounded theory and the Joya model. And, you know, I don't exactly prescribe to that model only. I do think that it's helpful to think in that way in terms of first order, second order, third order codes, especially if your data is very homogeneous. If you only have one person, you know, let's say you have a very homogeneous group you're interviewing and your data is very specific. I can, you know, then the idea about merging concepts together from you know, first order to second order to overarching concepts kind of makes more sense. I think that once your data is more heterogeneous, once you are developing ideas about things that evolve over time, when you have different actors that do different things at different times, the idea about first order, second order, third order codes kind of break down, because you don't have an overarching concepts that, you know, you have two different kinds of actors. You maybe have employees, you know, you have, let's say, customers and Uber drivers, right? And they're very different experience of the time they spend together in the vehicle, let's say. What's the overarching concept from that, right? Or is there contestation or conflict? Sometimes there's no overarching concept because it's about the category is not always created. Our conceptual world is not hierarchical, right? I mean, I think that the thing that I take kind of issue with the Joya model is because it's as though all of our concepts are structured hierarchical. But I'm a categorization scholar, and I know that that's not true, right? Actually, many of the concepts that constitute our theories cannot be represented in a hierarchy. Actually, what is more important is also the relationship between the categories that we evolve. This is also where I find that, I can see that the benefits of creating kind of a Joya diagram. I've done it myself, and it's very satisfying to do so. But then how do you get from those categories into your model? right? The relationship between the categories, to me, is nearly as important as generating the category itself, right? In the model, it's about how does one thing lead to another thing, right? What is the mechanism that moves between A and B, right? And maybe even how are different actors, right, behaving differently in different points in time. And that's also because I often do studies that have multiple actors, like 5 different communities working in a market over a 70-year period, right? There's no one overarching category that covers all of this period, right? It waxes and wanes over time. And so what I actually think is more, what I think is important is to say, yes, you develop your categories based on the data, but it doesn't always come through an overarching construct, right? Sometimes you develop a category that's actually, you develop an idea and a category based on its opposition to something, right? For example, I have a study of AIDS and the AIDS epidemic. And in the AIDS epidemic, what is really important is the contrast between purity and impurity, right? So it's not that there's an overarching concept, right? The problem is the contrast between homosexuals, drug addicts, and Asian immigrants that are seen as impure, and the white heterosexual majority that is seen as pure. And so, in a sense, the essence of the theory is about this moral boundary that is drawn, right, between these. And it doesn't, and that we came to this not through merging, right? It's not that pure, let's say, it's not that purity and impurity can be merged together to form moral boundary. It's in the contrast between impurity and purity that we see the moral boundary. Thus, I think if you want to put it into the Joya framework of first and second order framework, I think that, yes, the concepts, they emerge through a back and forth between merging and splitting and contestation that creates your concepts. But at the same time as you are doing that, you are actually also forming your model, which has to do with the relationship between them. And the relationship between them informs the concepts that you form, right? So developing the model and creating the data structure are not independent of one another. It's the same, it's the same process, right? Because you cannot just first merge all your categories together to form some overarching construct, and then boom, oh, now I'm putting those constructs together in a theory. The way the constructs are related to one another and the essence of your model and your theory, right, determines the kind of categories you create. And I know that is kind of a different point of view than is taken by most people in our field. But I also think that I come from this also, where I think that the Joya model and grounded theory came out of working with data that was more homogeneous, interviews with a fairly limited amount of people that didn't have very heterogeneous views of things. Whereas I think the more heterogeneous your data becomes, in my case, working with huge archival data sets that span 70 periods across, like 5 different actors, the idea that you could merge all of the ideas and categories together to form one overarching construct kind of breaks down. And so I think the more homogeneous your data is, the more the kind of Joya model kind of works, and the more heterogeneous your data becomes, the more it tends to break down, because you simply cannot, merge. Also, when you didn't create the data yourself, when it comes from archival data, where you didn't ask questions, right? So all of these things that are going on in your data, most of it is irrelevant to your question. So you can't be merging all of these irrelevant things because they never converge, right? There's no convergence, there's only divergence. So the more you actually need to think about data analysis in a much more dynamic way, where the model, your theoretical model, and the categories that you create from your data are intrinsically related. In terms of the way that you develop your theory.
That's an awesome answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Roger. Thank you, Stine. And we have the next one is Tigist. Tigist, can you please unmute yourself?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, please.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you, Professor, for a nice presentation that you made. My question is, how you say that the validity and the reliability, if I, for example, I make 25 life story interviews, so I'm in the middle of transcribing and coding. So since my interview was not in English, so I need to translate it. So I don't think so that it will work with using of softwares. So I just doing manually. So just transcribing manually and also coding manually. Would it that be create some, and it can create a problem on validity and also reliability of my data? Do you think so? That's my first question. Then I will proceed to the next.
I mean, I don't think that it's a problem at all doing manual transcription. I think most people do that. I mean, historically, that's what people do. I mean, this thing about using automated transcription, I think, you know, I mean, you have much higher validity when you do it yourself, and it's a human and not a computer that is helping you do it. And so I think that you have much more validity in your study when you're doing the transcription and you're coding yourself. And of course, you know, you'll be faced with, if you want to publish in English, right, you know, translating your informant's words from the other language into English, right? It does sometimes pose difficulties, but then you could maybe be upfront about that in your method section. I do think it's interesting because sometimes we do have issues, right, where people, you know, the kind of words that people use you might not have exactly an English equivalent from that for that particular concept, right?
Yeah, right. And also, if I outsource some of my data to be transcribed, would that also be okay if I did like that?
Yes, I think people do that, right? I mean, I think that's fine. You probably want to check it, right? You know, do some sampling and make sure that if you've transcribed some and others have transcribed other ones, and maybe also talk with the transcriptionist. I sometimes do that before they start transcribing, because you know, you can transcribe in many different ways. It's actually very theoretically interesting, right? About what do we transcribe and how, because of course we change what people say when we go from the spoken word into the written word. For example, do we transcribe all the and the repetitions and the and the, you know, there's a lot of things that sometimes are being said on on transcripts that are not really being transcribed, right? And so how close do we want to be to the actual spoken word versus something that is more easy to understand, right?
Yeah. So you,
and I think that people normally in our field of study have tended to kind of represented what people say in a way that was easy to understand, because people thought that all of those little words, all of the little and the were not important. And so that also makes sense of what the question is, because if you ask the linguist and they were doing that, they would find that, oh, all of those little sounds that people make while they're talking are actually really important for the way that meaning is conveyed, right? They would have probably a very different perspective on the way to transcriptions ought to be done. And so I think in that sense, it depends a little bit about the goal of the research, right? If it's more of a traditional management study, I think that transcribing it and representing the quotes in a way that is easy to understand without representing all of those little fill words are okay. But sometimes it's interesting, right? I mean, I'm doing a paper with vapors and smokers, and in a sense, we have a little bit more literal way that the transcriptions were made, and we've sometimes chose to represent that inside the quotes because it gives a feeling for the way the person talked. You sense the person more when you haven't removed all of those little repetitions and little small words people say.
Yeah, I understand. And thank you so much. I have only one question. Is that okay? Please. Is it possible to collect data while analyzing and coding my data in the middle time? Is it possible to communicate my perspective interviews? Is it okay?
I mean, I think it's great I think you should start thinking about what's the puzzle and analyzing your data from day one, right? I mean, in your mind, you should constantly be when you're interviewing, you should be thinking about what's puzzling here, and so doing a couple of interviews and then stop and then thinking about what's going on, I think is really important. So having those two things progress in parallel, I think is very important.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Tigis. There are a couple of points in the chat as well related to your question, and we are moving forward. We have Mohsin who raised their hand. Mohsin, can you please unmute yourself and put your question forward?
Just a mic check. Is it okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Hope you didn't raise your hand for the mic check.
It was a really great session. There's so much to know and more to digest and process further. My question is about something related to, let's say, I have done interviews and the recorded video that the facial impressions, expressions I use for the face reader analysis. So using that data with combining with the qualitative verbatim, or what do you think about stability in terms of being for the journals?
I had slightly different. Are you talking about facial expressions? I had difficulties hearing you. That the recorded facial expressions together with the interview,
and analyzing them through face reader software, and also understanding their verbatim as well. So trying to combine these two data sources from one kind of data.
I mean, I think that's super fascinating. As I talked about triangulation and looking at our topic from many different sources, right, can give us insight to other things. It might be that in the facial data, people are communicating some things that might not be said through the verbal communication, and sometimes it might be some people are more aligned in what they say and what they express, and others are not. And I think that sounds super fantastic, interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much.